Recently, I had a heated conversation with a loved one about politics. We all likely have. We were discussing potential presidential candidates for the upcoming 2024 election. Who would be the funniest? Who's most likely to win? Who should and shouldn't run? As such a talk is bound to do, we landed on Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, and Sam the Eagle lookalike. I'll be open and clear with my biases. I am a social democrat, so I despise DeSantis. My loved one, well, the conversation landed on me being told that DeSantis is not, in fact, homophobic. He is simply protecting children. We would have to disagree on what homophobia is. You know, I yelled, and if you know me, you know that I'm not much one for confrontation. I tend not to get angry, and my anger, when it does come, rarely manifests. But I yelled, left the conversation, and it kind of ruined my night. A couple of days before, I read a Twitter thread by Ryan Short, in which he described his reaction to a conversation in which his father mentioned continuing to vote for the GOP despite their support for anti-LGBT policies. His father said yes, that he would continue to vote for them. So Ryan sent out an email to his family. Hear me clearly. You cannot vote for the GOP and continue to have a relationship with me. Attacks in the USA by conservatives against LGBTQ+ communities are growing in legislative bodies, online, and in public spaces. You may be thinking, but Ryan, why are you disrupting the family over political disagreements? The safety of me, my husband, and my community is baseline, non-negotiable, and unrelated to politics. It becomes clear that defending queer and trans rights is necessary to defend our very family itself. Will you commit to not voting for the GOP ever again? Our love is massive, but it's not without conditions. Your unwavering support of LGBTQ+ peace is required. At the time that I wrote this script, his account was suspended. I wasn't sure why, but his letter did have a positive end. His father left his local Republican club and agreed. There were plenty of responses to that tweet. Support, of course. Discussion of collective queer trauma, chosen family love, and the joy of acceptance from those who love and or raised us. Some were pure vitriol. Some disagreed based off their own trauma and longing for family. I want to highlight a specific breed of negative response. The denial. You're a horrible person and I feel sorry for your dad. You're hurting him with your identity politics. He never did anything to hurt you. His vote doesn't hurt you, and everything you believe about Republicans is a lie. I'm thinking to murder me. Makes this seem like a parody account, Lamau. Nobody's trying to kill you. The mainstream GOP position is simply that literal children shouldn't be subjected to gender therapy / conversion and overt public sex acts. Or maybe, just maybe, you've been lied to about Republicans really think what the laws are actually about and the thoughts in other people's heads. But hey, why try to understand them when you can be a victim, right? There are multiple versions of this. The general gist is that the GOP is not homophobic. Voting conservative is not an act connected to or passively accepting homophobia. You know, that's what my loved one said. I've heard that a lot over the years. Someone told me once that opposing gay marriage isn't homophobic. That same person a few years before actually had shared an article calling for the biblical stoning of gay people. And she said the gays had started it. The Catholics on my old college campus and on Twitter now say it isn't homophobic to say all gay people should be celibate or marry people of the opposite sex. So, let's go in. This video will, by necessity and my own limitations, not be comprehensive. It will be long, and I apologize for that. But first, let's get to a common ground definition. Oftentimes when people are accused of homo, queer, transphobia, they'll turn into little cave imps dancing around and playing their idea of a semantics game. I'm not scared of them. Phobias are irrational fears and I'm not scared. Cool. They are, actually, but they're unlikely to do the digging to understand that connection to fear. The next step is sometimes to point out that it can mean hatred towards queer people, and they'll turn around with some kind of, I don't hate anyone, I love everyone hate the sin, love the sinner, you know, that kind of nonsense, right? I think ContraPoints in her video, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, framed it in a great way. Do you think there is anything that would qualify as homophobia? If not, then you're disguising your bigotry, which is so all-encompassing, under the idea of an objective reality, so you don't have to do any interrogation of your worldview or the harm that you might cause. So let's go with a third all-encompassing definition so that we're all on the same page. Homophobia. Fear, disgust, or hatred of those with non-heterosexual attractions, whether conscious or unconscious, often expressing itself in opposition to the political advancement of non-heterosexual persons. Replace the appropriate noun descriptors to get the definitions of transphobia, queerphobia, and so on. Now, if you use a definition of that sort to point out someone's homophobia, there's a chance they will still reject it. They do not want the label. But they might readily say that they oppose gay rights. And why is that? I'll get to that a little bit later, but just think about it. For the moment, when I say homophobia or transphobia, I mean it in the sense of opposition to LGBT rights, though that opposition is always fueled by the fear, disgust, and hatred of people different than us. Let's put a pin in that. I want to discuss in depth the big name Republicans in the ring for the GOP nomination going into 2024. Before I can do that, though, we need to not say gay. Normally when we talk about the Florida Don't Say Gay bill, people on my side tend to get accused of not reading the bill. So let's do the most entertaining thing possible and together read the entire text of HB 1557.
Florida House of Representatives HB 1557. An act relating to parental rights in education, amending Section 1001.42, Florida statute, requiring district school boards to adopt procedures that comport with certain provisions of law for notifying a student's parent of specified information, requiring such procedures to reinforce the fundamental right of parents to make decisions regarding the upbringing and control of their children in a specified manner, prohibiting the procedures from prohibiting a parent from accessing certain records, providing construction, prohibiting a school district from adopting procedures or student support forms that prohibit school district personnel from notifying a parent about specified information, or that encourage or have the effect of encouraging a student to withhold from a parent such information, prohibiting school district personnel from discouraging or prohibiting parental notification and involvement in critical decisions affecting a student's mental, emotional, or physical well-being, providing construction, prohibiting classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels or in a specified manner, requiring certain training developed or provided by a school district to adhere to standards established by the Department of Education, requiring school districts to notify parents of healthcare services and provide parents the opportunity to consent or decline such services, providing that a specified parental consent does not waive certain parental rights, requiring school districts to provide parents with certain questionnaires or health screening forms and obtain parental permission before administering such questionnaires and forms, requiring school districts to adopt certain procedures for resolving specified parental concerns, requiring resolution within a specified time frame, requiring the Commissioner of Education to appoint a special magistrate for unresolved concerns, providing requirements for the special magistrate, requiring the State Board of Education to approve or reject the special magistrate's recommendation within specified time frame, requiring school districts to bear the cost of the special magistrate, requiring the State Board of Education to adopt rules, providing requirements for such rules, authorizing the parent to bring an action against a school district to obtain a declaratory judgment that a school district procedure or practice violates certain provisions of law, providing for the additional award of injunctive relief, damages, and reasonable attorney fees and court costs to certain parents, requiring the school district to adopt policies to notify parents of certain rights, providing construction, requiring the department to review and update as necessary specified materials by a certain date, providing an effective date. Be it enacted by the legislature of the state of Florida. Section 1, paragraph C is added to subsection 8 of section 1001.42 Florida statutes to read 1001.42. Powers and duties of district school board. The district school board acting as a board shall exercise all powers and perform all duties listed below. 8. Student welfare. C. 1. In accordance with the rights of parents enumerated in subsection 1002.20 and 1014.04, adopt procedures for notifying a student's parent if there is a change in the student's services or monitoring related to the student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, and the school's ability to provide a safe and supportive learning environment for the student. The procedures must reinforce the fundamental right of parents to make decisions regarding the upbringing and control of their children by requiring school district personnel to encourage a student to discuss issues relating to his or her well-being with his or her parent, or to facilitate discussion of the issue with the parent. The procedures may not prohibit parents from accessing any of their students' education and health records created, maintained, or used by the school district as required by section 1002.222. 2. A school district may not adopt procedures or student support forms that prohibit school district personnel from notifying a parent about his or her student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, or a change in related services or monitoring, or that encourage or have the effect of encouraging a student to withhold from a parent such information. School district personnel may not discourage or prohibit parental notification of and involvement in critical decisions affecting a student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being. This subparagraph does not prohibit a school district from adopting procedures that permit school personnel to withhold such information from a parent if a reasonably prudent person would believe that disclosure would result in abuse, abandonment, or neglect, as those terms are defined in S 39.01. 3. Classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3, or in a manner that is not age-appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. 4. Student support services training developed or provided by a school district to school district personnel must adhere to student services guidelines, standards, and framework established by the Department of Education. 5. At the beginning of the school year, each school district shall notify parents of each healthcare service offered at their student school, and the option to withhold consent or decline any specific service. Parental consent to a healthcare service does not waive the parent's right to access his or her student's educational or health records, or to be notified about a change in his or her student's services or monitoring as provided by this paragraph. 6. Before administering a student well-being questionnaire or health screening form to a student in kindergarten through grade 3, the school district must provide the questionnaire or health screening form to the parent and obtain the permission of the parent. 7. Each school district shall adopt procedures for a parent to notify the principal or his or her designee regarding concerns under this paragraph at his or her student's school, and the process for resolving those concerns within 7 calendar days after notification by the parent. A. At a minimum, the procedure must require that within 30 days after notification by the parent that the concern remains unresolved, the school district must either resolve the concern or provide a statement of the reasons for not resolving the concern. B. If a concern is not resolved by the school district, a parent may 1. Request the Commissioner of Education to appoint a special magistrate who is a member of the Florida Bar in good standing and who has at least 5 years' experience in administrative law. The special magistrate shall determine facts relating to the dispute over the school district procedure or practice, consider information provided by the school district, and render a recommended decision for resolution to the State's Board of Education within 30 days after receipt of the request by the parent. The State Board of Education must approve or reject the recommended decision at its next regularly scheduled meeting that is more than 7 calendar days and no more than 30 days after the date the recommended decision is transmitted. The cost of the special magistrate shall be borne by the school district. The State Board of Education shall adopt rules, including forms, necessary to implement this subparagraph. 2. Bring an action against the school district to obtain a declaratory judgment that the school district procedure or practice violates this paragraph and seek injunctive relief. A court may award damages and shall award reasonable attorney fees and court costs to a parent who receives declaratory or injunctive relief. C. Each school district shall adopt policies to notify parents of the procedures required under this subparagraph. D. Nothing contained in this subparagraph shall be construed to abridge or alter rights of action or remedies in equity already existing under the common law or general law. Section 2. By June 30th, 2023, the Department of Education shall review and update as necessary school counseling frameworks and standards, educator practices and professional conduct principles, and any other student services personnel guidelines, standards, or frameworks in accordance with the requirements of this Act. Section 3. This Act shall take effect July 1st, 2022.
Exhilarating, isn't it? The most pertinent paragraph for us is paragraph 3. Classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3, or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. Now, what does that mean? That seems like a leading question where I'm going to immediately answer it for you with my interpretation, but it's an actual question I have. What does it mean? Classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity. What in this case does instruction mean? Is it teaching about what different orientations and genders are? Is it teaching on any events about gay rights? Is it some fantasy about teaching children to be a certain orientation or identity? In the preamble to the law, it says the act will be prohibiting classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels or in a specified manner. So then, does instruction mean discussion? According to an NBC article on the statute, law professor Charlton Copeland of the University of Miami says, "When I taught them statutory interpretation, and one of the things that courts certainly do, is to look at the preamble to assess, well, what's the scope of that term called instruction?" And I do a lot of voices, you're just gonna have to get used to them. So in other words, the preamble defines for us what the authors meant. Instruction here means discussion. So let's insert that in place of the word instruction and reread that part of the bill to get a clearer meaning. Classroom discussion by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3, or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. That is a clearer and yet more broad bill. Discussion may not occur. Discussion on sexual orientation may not occur. So, despite what the bill's supporters may think, in legalese, that translates roughly to the slogan, "Do not say gay." If a student has 2 mommies and another student is curious about that, do not answer the question. Don't mention that boys can have crushes on boys when one does. If a student is being bullied for expressing a queer crush, you can make a vague anti-bullying statement, but you can't affirm that it's okay for that child to have their silly little stupid crush. Now, supporters of the bill may roll their eyes at those potentials, but the bill itself makes no exception in that way. It says no instruction, and by the way of the preamble, we know that means no discussion. It does not say no discussion with the exception of. It just says no discussion. Now, that's not our only vaguity in this bill. What is sexual orientation? We can charitably assume that the authors focus on the sex part of that phrase, but I just mentioned crushes and parents. Colloquially, sexual orientation is a phrase that encompasses both sexual and romantic inclination. The text of the bill makes no distinction between those two things. As such, we can only come to two conclusions. Either the authors meant that queer romantic orientation is open for discussion and only sexual orientation is off limits. Or the authors are using the broader and more widely used definition, which encompasses both. The text does not specify. I assume most others, will assume the latter of those two options. I think it's the more likely intent as well. So then, there's no discussion of romantic inclination, and I think we can all readily assume that children of the specified age range are not experiencing sexual attraction. The world they occupy is of romantic, silly, stupid little crushes. Mommy has a crush on Daddy, but we can't discuss crushes. No more Valentine's Day parties. When a teacher gets married, better not change your last name because then you'd have to explain. If a pregnant teacher is asked what pregnant means, the canned, stereotypical answer of when a mommy and a daddy love each other very much. That's a discussion on sexual orientation. Mrs. can no longer be used in the classroom. It implies marital status. Marital status implies romantic inclination. Romantic inclination is sexual orientation. Let's keep going. What is gender identity? The bill does not specify what they believe this to mean. Now, obviously, they meant trans and gender non-conforming people, but that's not what the bill says. The bill says there is to be no instruction, thereby discussion, of gender identity. If a student has a mommy and a daddy, and then later in the year they actually have a mommy and a mommy, even though they're the same people, a child who asks about that will be left without an answer. If a child has an intersex loved one, they can't ask about that. If they have a trans loved one, they can't ask about that, or rather they can, but they will not have their questions answered. If a male student is bullied for behaving in a stereotypically feminine way, a teacher can give a vague anti-bullying statement, but can that teacher affirm that it's okay to act outside of gender norms, or is that suddenly discussion of gender identity? When acting out a story and a girl wants to play a prince, can the teacher allow that, or is allowing that, in a way, discussion of gender identity? Girls can be princes too. Can a teacher deny that, or would that be discussion of gender identity? If this means a teacher must adhere to a child's biological sex, then how is a teacher allowed to refer to an intersex student, regardless of how they present or identify? Being super uncharitable, gender identity removes all pronouns. Mrs. was already denied, but now so are Mr. and Miss. Teacher is all that remains. Surely, I'm done now taking the piss out of that law. No, I'm not. Third parties. We can assume that means anyone who is not an instructor or a student. Discussion by anyone besides a student. Okay? Parents who come in to talk about their jobs. No one who works weddings can discuss those except in the vaguest terms possible. No mention of brides or grooms. Two parents of the same gender cannot show up together and mention their marriage. Who else is a third party? Administrators? Counselors? Suddenly all those who can respond to bullying issues are not allowed to help a child not internalize the bullying they received. Saying it's okay to have a crush on another boy or it's okay to have two mommies is discussion and affirmation of sexual orientation. Books. If an author's book includes an LGBT character and is in a school, are they liable as a third party providing discussion? Is their publisher? The illustrator? How about the librarian? Probably the librarian, isn't it? But we haven't even touched yet on the second half of that sentence. A refresher may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3 or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. Well, isn't that interesting? I was told by my loved one, with whom I had that heated conversation, that it was protecting children grade 3 and under, that age doesn't need to know. But the bill uses the word or. The second half does not modify or restrict itself based off age. If the state determines that sexual orientation and gender identity are inherently adult taboo subjects, the discussion ban rises throughout all of primary education. Can a high school teacher discuss Pulse nightclub, the AIDS epidemic? So many classics are ripe with sex and gender play. Are they banned? When you teach Shakespeare, are you forbidden from mentioning that often boys played the female role? In Oedipus, a man claws his eyes out because he's been sleeping with his mom. Is that age appropriate for a minor? Or is violent straight incest more innocent than queer people simply existing? They have since extended the bill, which we will get to, but the law is intentionally vague. The lawsuit page where school districts will pay for any investigation is paired with the vagueness in order to scare schools and teachers into compliance beyond any reasonable good faith interpretation. That way, they may save themselves the financial and harassmental burden of lawsuits. The entire premise is that queer people are inherently inappropriate by the nature of our existence. That is dehumanizing. It's homophobic, transphobic, bigoted. My having a husband is no more inappropriate than a woman having a husband. To believe elsewise requires the belief that my eventual marriage will be lesser of a different quality. It is to believe that I am not allowed around children by the state of my being. That is homophobic. The law, by its nature, is homophobic. There is no denying that. Do you want to know the true reason for the bill? Sponsor Dennis Baxley, according to CNN, made the bill because children are coming out more now. He thinks it might be because schools are encouraging that. He said, there really is a dynamic concern of how much of this are genuine types of experiences and how many of them are kids trying on different kinds of things that they hear about. So rather than allow people to figure out who they are, Baxley made this bill so the schools can shut up and hopefully less people will be queer. Because he views queer as being a social contagion. Because he is both a bigot and an idiot. So now, let's get to the 2024 GOP candidates. Before we do, I want to say, out of the generosity of my spirit and out of the hope that people can grow and change over the years, I will do my best to only use statements from within the 21st century, and the more recent the better. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Ron DeSantis. It only makes sense to go from the Don't Say Gay bill to the governor who oversaw its implementation in Florida, Ron DeSantis. So, it's time to throw in that update I mentioned. The Florida State Board of Education, staffed by DeSantis appointees, have proposed the following update to the Principles of Professional Conduct for the Education Profession of Florida, 6A-10.081. Rule 6, the one placed by the Don't Say Gay bill, is proposed to be edited to change it from kindergarten to 3rd grade to pre-kindergarten. It also adds a new Rule 7, which says that educators shall not intentionally provide classroom instruction to students in grades 4 through 12 on sexual orientation or gender identity unless such instruction is either expressly required by state academic standards or is part of a reproductive health course or health lesson for which a student's parent has the option to have his or her student not attend. LGBT people and our existences are to be confined to very specific lessons or to be optional sex ed classes, which automatically sexualizes our entire existence and allows parents to effectively censor our existence out of their child's entire life. Though I'll be honest, I believe allowing sex ed courses to be optional in any capacity is a mistake of the educational system that should be corrected. Sex ed should be both mandatory and comprehensive. When critiqued over the original Don't Say Gay law by Disney, DeSantis and the Florida GOP passed retaliatory legislation aimed to punish Disney. After taking control of the special administrative zone that includes Disney World theme park, DeSantis said of the board, according to NPR, "When you lose your way, you gotta have people that are going to tell you the truth. All these board members very much would like to see the type of entertainment that all families can appreciate." In light of the events leading to this shakeup, it's clear. DeSantis plans to use the board to harass Disney if it continues its slow march towards inclusion of LGBT people in its properties. I can only imagine it would want them to end their gay days as well, and why they can't control creative decisions of the company, they can't do their best to make life hell for the park unless it follows their conservative will. So here's a question. Who did DeSantis appoint to the board? Besides 3 lawyers that I didn't find much about, there are 2 interesting placements. These sections will be brief because we're overall talking about DeSantis here, but still. The Disney Board. Bridget Ziegler. According to NPR, co-founded the group Moms for Liberty, a so-called parental rights organization that, on its resources for parents section of its website, links to notorious anti-gay hate group the Heritage Foundation. Ron Perry. Ron Perry leads the Christian nationalist group The Gathering, which argues that the United States is a Christian nation that should be ruled by Christianity, or his interpretation of it at the least. In a slideshow called Ethics in the Christian, The Gathering discusses, vaguely and sometimes not well, schools of philosophy. In its section on hedonism, it says transgender reassignment may seem good at the moment, but likewise devastating in the future. weirdly implying that trans affirmation of any sort is hedonistic. These people are idiots. Perry, according to Business Insider, also blames the statistical rise of homosexuality on estrogen and tap water in a society no longer constraining evil. Back to the man of the hour himself, Ron DeSantis. Before he was a governor, DeSantis was a member of Congress as a representative. So, we have his voting records. When he served in the 114th Congress, the Human Rights Campaign gave him a score of 0 when it came to LGBT support. This includes his voting against 2 amendments put forward that session that would ban federal contractors from discriminating against LGBT people in the Departments of Transportation, HUD, VA, and in military construction. DeSantis' State Board of Education declared their support of the idea that Title IX sex discrimination bans do not apply to trans people. According to Jacksonville Today, Esther Bird, a DeSantis appointee to the board, said, "I believe reading sexual orientation and gender identity into Title IX is not only legally incorrect, but it undermines the intent of Title IX." On a Fox News appearance, DeSantis spoke out against the Respect for Marriage Act, claiming there was no need for it, and its opponents have valid religious concerns. Oh, they're concerned. The law forces states to acknowledge gay and interracial marriages performed in other states, though it wouldn't make them issue marriage licenses if the relevant SCOTUS cases end up getting struck down. DeSantis filed a complaint against Our House, a Miami bar, supposedly out of outrage that children were allowed to be around drag queens. According to NBC News, the complaint cited a 1947 Supreme Court of Florida ruling that calls drag queen performances that are suggestive a public nuisance that corrupt morals and are therefore things the state has an interest in shutting down. A fun fact about that case, much like DeSantis' own pet law, it's a little vague. Suggestive is a subjective thing. In certain religious communities, a woman showing her leg is sexually explicit. That's just a fun fact. But it's all about protecting children, though. After all, before the Don't Say Gay bill was passed, DeSantis' then press secretary, Christina Pushaw, I don't give a shit, had some words about protecting children. According to The Hill, she said the bill is more accurately the anti-grooming bill, and if you disagree with a vaguely written law that was put forward in an attempt to keep children in the closet, you're a pedophile. But Pushaw doesn't come out and call specific people pedophile, because that might be actionable. So she says groomer, a little vaguer. Because to acknowledge the existence of queer people is the same as trying to fuck a kid. Sometimes boys have crushes on boys, and that's fine, a teacher might say, and that's obviously the same thing as a teacher pulling down their underwear in the middle of class and masturbating. In 2021, according to CNN, DeSantis objected to spending state funds on housing programs for homeless queer youths. So much for protecting the children. That same year, his Department of Education removed federal anti-bullying links about queer youth. Supposedly, the links were made into political advocacy platforms. According to that same CNN article, the biggest change was going from LGBTQ youth to LGBTQI+. So apparently being against the bullying of intersex children is a step too far into liberal ideology for Florida. It's not about protecting children. DeSantis does not care about children. Children are just useful tools for him to get useful dupes to hate the people that he hates. If he says it's to protect the children, then supposedly well-meaning people might not recognize the homophobia and transphobia. Or, more accurately, it makes it easier for them to pretend that it's not there and continue to harm their loved ones by supporting it. Next. Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina and former ambassador to the UN, announced her campaign on February 14th, 2023, Valentine's Day. That, as we're about to find out, is a little bit ironic for her. Haley has her own critique of the Don't Say Gay bill. Her take? It doesn't go far enough. According to an article in The Guardian, she said, "I'm sorry. I don't think that goes far enough. When I was in school, you didn't have sex ed until 7th grade. And even then, your parents had to sign whether you could take the class. That's a decision for parents to make." Haley immediately going towards a sex ed class is revealing. The law does not specify sexual education. Nikki is taking the LGBT community and sexualizing our entire existence. While she singles out gender, it's not that big of a stretch to think that she would include orientation in the same question. So therefore, students should only learn about queer people and queer existence in the confines of a sex ed class that parents are allowed to opt their children out of. Given the interpretation of third parties to include school librarians, now no art containing LGBT characters should be allowed in public schools except in the context of optional sex ed classes. The article further goes on to quote Haley as having said, "We should not be talking to kids in elementary school about gender, period. And if you are going to talk to kids about it, you need to get the parents' permission to do that." Did you catch that? It's the same switch that the law does. Instruction has become discussion. "That is not something that schools need to be teaching," she says. "They don't need to be teaching whether they think you're a boy or a girl." The switch happens again. Discussion is now called instruction. With the last sentence, it becomes clear that Haley is pretending as if discussing trans people, gender expression, or the very concept of gender is the same as transing the kids. It's a nod to the idea of Section 28 in England. We must ban exposure because exposure leads to social contagion. Social contagion, by the way, is utter nonsense. It has no proof. It's pure homophobic and transphobic garbage. And no one of any intellectual ability actually believes in it. And that's why I said Haley is pretending, because she knows that she's incorrect. And she's dabbling in these waters anyway because she believes that it will help her politically. Now, this is speculation on my part, but I also want to zero in on Haley's specificity there. She complains that the law does not go far enough in terms of gender. She does not mention sexual orientation. At the same time, she does not criticize the law for going after sexual orientation. She doesn't say that she thinks it too should be shut out of schools, but she doesn't say that it shouldn't be. I think that's deliberate. In my opinion, it was a calculated challenge to DeSantis. Nikki bills herself as solidly conservative while being more calm and moderate than some of the more popular members of her party. By making this comment, her air of moderacy makes it seem as if the expanded version of the law is the minimum position. If DeSantis didn't expand, she could have called him weak. Now that he has, she can take credit for that maneuver, saying he didn't do it until after she called him out on it. Now, her halfway commentary by only mentioning gender gives her a second move here. If the action is taken positively by the base on all levels, she can champion it in its entirety and take, on some level, credit for that expansion. If the base does not enjoy the law and the culture war, she can say now that the law goes too far. After all, she only called for it to include discussion on gender, not on sexual orientation. It's a calculated and cowardly statement, in my opinion, because Nikki Haley does not have any actual beliefs. She's feckless. Back in 2014, as South Carolina governor, Nikki Haley opposed gay marriage, saying that she personally believes marriage should only be between a man and a woman, even if she no longer makes a fuss over holding that belief. That was nearly a decade ago, so maybe it doesn't count. What other things has Nikki been saying? Well, at CPAC, according to the Human Rights Campaign, Haley said, "We need our military to be stronger than ever. But what does Joe Biden have our troops doing? Taking gender pronoun classes. That disgusts me. Our troops already know the difference between men and women. His woke self-loathing has swept our country. It's in the classroom, the boardroom, and the bathrooms of government." Acknowledging and being accepting of trans people apparently makes people weak. Self-loathing. Haley wants to bring strength back to the bathrooms of government, because she is a strong piece of shit. On that same idea, conflating trans with weak, Haley apparently said on Fox in 2022, "I look at what's happening with this woke culture in our schools, wanting our kids to decide their gender. What I will tell you is we need to snap out of it. This is absolute craziness. We've got enemies trying to come after us, and America has been naive. It's been weakened." Which seems to me to imply that if we were to suffer an attack on American soil or to lose a military battle, Nikki might place the blame on trans people. Now, how does that make sense? It doesn't. Ideologically, it feels like a successor to those people who blamed natural disasters on the growing acceptance of gay people. Nikki's basically saying, Katrina? Oh, that's because of the transes. Nikki may not be the worst of the field, but she is in no way, shape, or form an ally. Next. Donald Trump, the criminal of the group. Former President Trump implemented a trans military ban. The two judges who struck down the conversion therapy bans in Florida were appointed by Trump. Trump opposed the Equality Act, which would prevent discrimination on basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Attorney General Sessions of the Trump administration declared that the Department of Justice would cease arguing trans people have federal protection from discrimination in employment. Trump's DOJ also filed a brief in SCOTUS and Bostock v. Clayton County that sexual orientation is not covered by Title VII prohibition on sex discrimination. On a similar note, coming from the same base argument, Trump's Health and Human Services Department attempted to roll back rules that would prevent discrimination based on gender identity and expression. The administration denied embassies the ability to fly pride flags during Pride Month. His State Department announced a commission on unalienable rights to help shape policy on human rights. The commission alluded to focusing on principles of natural laws, a dog whistle we'll get to when we discuss the GOP platform. In declaring his re-election bid, Trump railed against trans participation in sports and seemed to show extreme support for DeSantis' Don't Say Gay bill by threatening schools who engage in gender insanity with loss of federal funding. Sorry, I don't really do a Trump impression. I don't do impressions. I'm not good at them. Trump's vice president was Mike Pence, famous homophobe and notorious bigot. But really, when I want to critique Trump on LGBT issues, I really want to look at and focus on the GOP party platform for 2016 and 2020. As the nominee, Trump and his lackeys had a lot of leverage in shaping and accepting the platform, while they may not have directly wrote it. So, let's get started. Interlude. To break up the continuum of bigotry, I want to cut in here with resources. The Human Rights Campaign conducts research, lobbies politicians, and fights for LGBT+ rights across the country. The Trevor Project is an LGBT+ youth advocacy organization whose goal is to improve the mental health of kids and reduce suicide rates. They offer crisis support, for instance. The ACLU is the leading legal defender of civil rights in the United States, issuing legal challenges to unconstitutional laws and fighting for LGBT people. Coming right on the heels of the ACLU in legal battles and advocacy for the community, there's Lambda Legal. Advocacy group GLAD has further resources and links than the few I've mentioned. They also helped me find several of the sources I have used in this video. There are numerous organizations and people, as well as donors, who are in this fight who support you, me, and every queer person's rights and dignities. If you have the funds, consider donating to those organizations if you can. If you have the funds, donate to mutual aid. Look for GoFundMe and other fundraising pages and share them or contribute. However, money, especially extra money, can be pretty hard to come by, and I definitely understand that. So what else can you do? Protest. Use social media. Have conversations with your friends, family. Call your legislators, and party representatives. At town halls, ask direct, challenging questions in as calm a way as you can manage. Do you support conversion therapy, for instance? One weepy radical thing I think you can do as well, regardless of whether or not you are queer. And I know this is going to sound very hippie of me and not very useful politically, but extend love and care to those around you. Life can be cripplingly lonely. When your rights are debated as if your humanity is up for question, there is pain. Pain can easily become overwhelming. So in a world that can be cruel, offer love, offer community. Make your loved ones aware of how much you care for them. Share compliments, share art, share joy. The fight is important. And you can sustain off anger, sure, for a while. You can sustain off passion for a while. But people need love. They need joy. And we need to be sustained beyond our fights. Be careful and be kind to yourself. Now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. The Republican Party's national platform. So, party national platforms are not shaped by any one person in specific. However, the stronger your showing in the primary, the more power, generally speaking, you technically have to move the platform in your favor. Therefore, in regards to the GOP platform in 2016, I do not buy any argument that the overall tone and policy prescriptions are not pieces accepted by Trump and his allies. This is not to say that they were the ones to put such provisions in the platform. As such, I also place the platform on the backs of the party as a whole. It goes beyond any singular individual. Now, let's talk about the GOP platform's for 2016 and 2020. 2020 is easy, honestly, because they simply adopted the 2016 platform. Now, I don't actually fault them for this. The convention would otherwise have been in the midst of the beginning throes of the COVID pandemic and would therefore affect participation in the creation and lobbying for revisions to the platform. It does, however, mean the 2016 platform is still the applicable document. Page 9, heading A Rebirth of Constitutional Government, subsection We the People, paragraph 2. We denounce bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, ethnic prejudice, and religious intolerance. Therefore, we dispose discrimination based on race, sex, religion, creed, disability, or national origin, and support statutes to end such discrimination. You may notice something that is missing from that list. There is no mention of sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, if we had no other data, we could reasonably assume that such protections fall under the opposition to sex discrimination, and that homophobia and transphobia fall under denounced bigotry. However, given that the Trump administration argued in court that prohibition on sex discrimination does not prohibit LGBT plus discrimination, we can more reasonably infer then that the GOP does not in this platform oppose discrimination against people on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Perhaps the anti-discrimination takes by the GOP have been guided by that lack of inclusion in the platform. Page 10, same section, subsection The Judiciary, paragraph 1. Only a Republican president will appoint judges who respect the rule of law expressed within the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, including the inalienable right to life and the laws of nature and nature's God, as did the late Justice Antonin Scalia. Only such appointments will enable courts to begin to reverse the long line of activist decisions, including Roe, Obergefell, and the Obamacare cases, that have usurped Congress's and states' law-making authority, undermined constitutional protections, expanded the power of the judiciary, and at the expense of the people and their elected representatives, and stripped the people of their power to govern themselves. You may note several odd things there. We'll get to laws of nature and nature's God and Scalia later. Put a pin in those for a second. Obergefell v. Hodges is the SCOTUS case that struck down gay marriage bans across the country in the summer of 2015. I was a junior in high school. You will hear people say that no one is coming after marriage equality, but the platform says otherwise. There are only two specifically named cases here. They finally got their wish with Roe v. Wade. As of right now, there is no platform to suggest that the party is not still aiming for the end of Obergefell. In the Dobbs case that overturned Roe, Justice Clarence Thomas, in a concurring statement, says that we should consider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell, because any substantive due process decision is demonstrably erroneous. We have a duty to correct this error established in those precedents. He then goes on to say that that doesn't say that the courts won't find those rights in the Constitution, but that they should still overturn those decisions. Yeah, he's very good faith. He's not going to do anything. That's a SCOTUS justice saying that the Dobbs decision should spur conservatives to bring cases before the court to challenge Obergefell, marriage equality, and Lawrence v. Texas, the 2003 decision that found sodomy laws unconstitutional. In other words, striking down bans against gay sex and technically straight sex that wasn't procreative. Page 11, same section, subsection, defending marriage against an activist judiciary. That itself should tell you where this is going to go. But let's read it anyway. Traditional marriage and family, based on marriage between one man and one woman, is the foundation for a free society and has for millennia been entrusted with rearing children and instilling cultural values. We condemn the Supreme Court's ruling in United States v. Windsor, which wrongly removed the ability of Congress to define marriage policy in federal law. We also condemn the Supreme Court's lawless ruling in Obergefell v. Hodges, which, in the words of the late Justice Antonin Scalia, was a judicial push full of silly extravagances that reduced the disciplined legal reasoning of John Marshall and Joseph Story to the mystical aphorisms of a fortune cookie. In Obergefell, 5 unelected lawyers robbed 320 million Americans of their legitimate constitutional authority to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. The court twisted the meaning of the 14th Amendment beyond recognition. To echo Scalia, we dissent. We therefore support the appointment of justices and judges who respect the constitutional limits on their power and respect the authority of the states to decide such fundamental social questions. The very first sentence is chock full of homophobia. The implication of traditional marriage being the foundation for a free society is that same-sex marriage is the upending and destruction of a free society. The second half of that sentence implies that queer couples will not be up to the task to raise children and teach them right from wrong. The implication there is that being gay showcases an inherent lack of ability to access reason and morality. The first sentence holds an implication that same-sex marriage will destroy society because gay people are immoral. Windsor struck down the Defense of Marriage Act signed by President Clinton that prohibited the federal government from recognizing same-sex marriages. Later in the paragraph, though, the platform says that this should be left up to the states. That alone shows that they don't actually care about the carrier that they use to ship their bigotry. If this was purely a states' rights issue, they would want the federal government to have no ability to restrict or define marriage at all, instead extending full federal benefits to any marriage recognized by the state in which it was performed. But that's not their argument. Their argument is that Congress should be able to bar it, correct the course of those immoral states. In that paragraph, the GOP again states their opposition to Obergefell and their desire to see it overturned. They dissent. They would like to do away with marriage equality. This is not a statement about individual Republicans. This is the National Party platform. It speaks for the party. The paragraph ends with a promise that the GOP wants judges who will overturn Obergefell. In other words, lower courts who will serve up dissent in the circuit courts, so SCOTUS and Thomas can take up the case and overturn marriage rights. Page 11, same section, subsection, the First Amendment, religious liberty. Paragraph 2. We endorse the First Amendment Defense Act, Republican legislation in the House and Senate which will bar government discrimination against individuals and businesses for acting on the belief that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. This act would protect the non-profit tax status of faith-based adoption agencies, the accreditation of religious educational institutions, the grants and contracts of faith-based charities and small businesses, and the licensing of religious professions. Now, if you take Senator Mike Lee's word for it, who introduced FATA, which thankfully did not pass, it would not allow for discrimination in commerce, employment, health benefits, housing, or federal benefits. If you take his word for it. Now, I don't necessarily understand, because if it prohibits the government from taking action against individuals and businesses who act in accordance with their religious belief in so-called traditional marriage, but it doesn't let people discriminate, then it doesn't do anything. Contrary to Lee's assessment, NBC News, in an analysis of the law, says it would allow for discrimination. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, in a document arguing for that law and their interpretation, seem to believe it would allow the Boy Scouts, for instance, to bar gay men from being scout leaders without being subject to discrimination laws. Or at least it would bar the federal government from taking action on that front, as FATA can't define state law. So it seems to come together that the law would allow individuals and businesses to discriminate in any way they wish when it comes to sexual orientation and sexual behavior, so long as that discrimination comes from a religious belief. So would it support Kim Davis in her refusal to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples? That seems to be the implication to me. The platform, in endorsing the law and in the words surrounding it, and their urge for states to pass their own versions of this law, it seems to be endorsing discrimination against LGBT persons. Page 12, same section, same subsection, paragraph 4. We support the right of the people to conduct their businesses in accordance with their religious beliefs and condemn public officials who have proposed boycotts against businesses that support traditional marriage. We pledge to protect those business owners who have been subject to hate campaigns, threats of violence, and other attempts to deny their civil rights. Now, hot take, I'm against threats and acts of violence and agree that those things should be condemned. However, this paragraph condemns calls for boycotts. That condemnation in connection to the second paragraph seems to imply that boycotts are either hate campaigns or denials of civil rights that the GOP vows to protect them against. Does this mean censoring of free speech for public officials and restricting their First Amendment rights? If boycotts and public campaigns against businesses for their beliefs and practices is wrong, is there any advocacy against anti-queer bigotry that is okay? What about when you lost control over Bud Light? Page 31, section, Great American Families, Education, Healthcare, and Criminal Justice, subsection, Marriage, Family, and Society, paragraph 1. Foremost among those institutions is the American family. It is the foundation of civil society, and the cornerstone of the family is natural marriage, the union of one man and one woman. Its daily lessons, cooperation, patience, mutual respect, responsibility, self-reliance are fundamental to the order and progress of our republic. Strong families, depending upon God and one another, advance the cause of liberty by lessening the need for government in their daily lives. Conversely, as we have learned over the last 5 decades, the loss of faith in family leads to greater dependence upon government. Here we again have a statement that straight marriage is the cornerstone of society. As no one is suggesting doing away with marriages between people of the opposite sex, we can only assume that the implication then is instead that same-sex marriages are against civil society. As straight marriage is called natural marriage, it's clear that same-sex marriage is unnatural, a statement whose only natural conclusion is that being gay is against nature. With the statement about faith in God juxtaposed with comments on marriage, not only is the GOP disparaging people of different faiths, they seem to be making a claim that affirming Christians and queer Christians have lost their faith. There also seems to be a baseless assumption that same-sex marriages result in families that depend more on the government. Pages 31 and 32, same section and subsection, paragraph 3. The data and the facts lead to an inescapable conclusion. Every child deserves a married mom and dad. The reality remains that millions of American families do not have the advantages that come with that structure. Our laws and our government's regulations should recognize marriage as the union of one man and one woman and actively promote married life as the basis of a stable and prosperous society. For that reason, as explained elsewhere in this platform, we do not accept the Supreme Court's redefinition of marriage, and we urge its reversal, whether through judicial reconsideration or constitutional amendment returning control over marriage to the states. We oppose government discrimination against businesses or entities which decline to sell items or services to individuals for activities that go against their religious views about such activities. So we open with the idea that children raised by straight couples have better outcomes than children raised by same-sex parents. The paragraph states that the data leads them to that conclusion. They are lying. The data does not say that. The American Psychological Association says there is no evidence that parenting effectiveness and childhood outcomes are at all related to the orientation of the parents. A meta-analysis of studies on the issue published in the BMJ Global Health Journal found little to no deviation in family outcomes between same-sex and opposite-sex families. If the first statement is wrong, since the data clearly does not agree, why make the statement? It's to imply that gay people are bad at raising children and therefore should not have the right to marriage. But since the data does not agree with this statement, it becomes clear that this is a statement of bias that doesn't care about facts or civil rights. In other words, it's plain and clear bigotry. We then get another statement that they want the government not to recognize marriage equality, though here it goes a step further by saying that our regulation should also not recognize gay marriages, which would seem to me to mean that even if it goes back to the states and a state recognizes marriage equality, the federal government would be meant to pass regulations acting as if that marriage is invalid. The platform states that they will try to undo marriage equality either through the court system or through a constitutional amendment, supposedly sending it to the states. But given that they have time and time again made it clear that where a state might pass marriage equality, they would want the federal government to not recognize said marriage, one must imagine their proposed amendment would instead outlaw marriage equality directly in the Constitution. Then we get another statement that they are against the government punishing people for enacting discrimination. A right not to sell items or services. Now, someone might say that it's about religious conscience when it comes specifically to the ceremony a la Masterpiece, but that's not what they said. Let's say, for argument's sake, that a group holds a religious belief that gay marriage is wrong and that sex is only for marriage. Maybe they would have an issue with having to provide health insurance that covers PrEP, a preventative drug used in the fight against HIV. Claiming that covering it is the same as encouraging people to act upon their same-sex desires and love, which would be immoral. Perhaps a judge would find that that would, in fact, violate their rights to religious freedom. Maybe that court case would be called Braidwood Management because the platform does matter, because it is used by the party as a roadmap, because it is used to deteriorate queer rights as they promised that it would. This is an argument that allows for discrimination. If a married couple books a hotel room, can the hotel then decline them a room when they learn that they're two men? Because allowing them to share a room together as a married couple would somehow be blessing their union. Family photographers can deny family portraits on the basis of orientation of the parents. Kim Davis can refuse to issue marriage licenses. Adoption agencies can freely discriminate. And that's why the first assertion is there. Not because the data agrees with them, it doesn't. It's because pretending that it does lets them more easily get into their next bit. Page 32, same section and subsection, paragraph 4. Families formed or enlarged by adoption strengthen our communities and ennoble our nation. Private entities which facilitate adoptions enrich our communities. We support measures such as the First Amendment Defense Act to ensure these entities do not face discrimination because of their views on marriage and family. Adoption agencies should be allowed to discriminate against gay couples and couples wherein one or more partners trans without government intervention. That's one statement. On its own, nothing new. When you get to the previous incorrect statement on child rearing, though, it seems as if in the GOP's mind, the government has a vested interest in not only allowing discrimination and adoption, but actively encouraging it, if not outright outlawing gay adoption. According to an NBC News article, 8 states passed laws permitting state licensed and partially funded agencies to refuse to place children with gay couples if they claim that their discrimination is based in religion. The same article says that the Trump administration, another mark against the man, allowed agencies in South Carolina to discriminate against queer people despite receiving federal funding, issuing an exemption specifically for them. We'll get into more details on that later. Page 35, same section, subsection Title 9, paragraph 1. That language opened up for girls and women a world of opportunities that had too often been denied to them. That same provision of law is now being used by bureaucrats and by the current President of the United States to impose a social and cultural revolution upon the American people by wrongly redefining sex discrimination to include sexual orientation or other categories. They are determined to reshape our schools and our entire society to fit the mold of an ideology alien to America's history and traditions. Their edict to states concerning restrooms, locker rooms, and other facilities is at once illegal, dangerous, and ignores privacy issues. This was before Bostock v. Clayton County, which upheld that discrimination based on orientation and gender identity is, of course, sex discrimination. It can only make sense now that this is yet another case that furthered the rights of LGBT Americans that the GOP would like to reverse. Their argument in this paragraph is that discrimination against LGBT people is permitted in the United States. They do not say that Title IX does not apply and therefore Congress should pass a law to amend it to say such. Remember earlier in their list of discriminations that they're opposed to, they didn't mention discrimination against queer and gender non-conforming people? They argue time and time again that people and businesses should be allowed to discriminate on religious grounds. The argument here then twists the very ideas of what sex is so as to avoid extending protections to LGBT people. If someone discriminates against a man for being married to a man, but would not have if he were married to a woman, that is by definition discrimination based upon sex. If someone is gender non-conforming or trans, discrimination against them is discrimination based upon assumptions that you have made about their sex and how it should be expressed. That again is cut and dry, clearly sex discrimination. Not only do they argue for discrimination in this paragraph, they say that extending non-discrimination laws to LGBT people is a concept alien to the United States. Which, perhaps protecting our citizens and upholding equality is often a concept alien to our government. Clearly, throughout history, it is a time-honored tradition. Their final statement is just blatant transphobia. That doesn't need an explanation, so I won't give one. Page 37, same section, subsection, protecting individual conscience and health care. There's only one paragraph. It is heinous. America's healthcare professionals should not be forced to choose between following their faith and practicing their profession. We respect the rights of conscience of healthcare professionals doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and organizations, especially the faith-based groups which provide a major portion of care for the nation and the needy. We support the ability of all organizations to provide, purchase, or enroll in healthcare coverage consistent with religious, moral, or ethical conviction without discrimination or penalty. We support the right of parents to determine the proper medical treatment and therapy for their minor children. A religious hospital in a rural area wherein a patient is admitted via emergency transportation and is then held in a room for recovery. Imagine that. Let's say his life is no longer in danger. His husband comes to visit him. By all rights under federal law and recognition, he is allowed to see his spouse. The religious hospital, or the receptionist on duty, or the doctors and nurses in charge of the patient's care do not believe in same-sex marriage. And following the law and allowing that visit, they are recognizing that couple has the rights of a married couple. Should the hospital be allowed to refuse that man the right to see his husband? According to the GOP here, it seems the answer is yes. Obviously, ethically, any idea of allowing a healthcare provider to discriminate on the basis of their faith is disgusting. It violates the Hippocratic Oath. It violates basic decency and the right to life that the GOP pretends to uphold. Now, I don't believe that they're advocating here a reading of the law that would allow for insurance companies or employees to not extend spousal healthcare benefits to legally married couples. They might wish for the government to not be able to act upon that kind of discrimination, but I haven't seen a legal theory put forth that would allow for it beyond a potential uses of their fatter dream. So yes, what I've said so far about this paragraph I find to be disturbing in its own right, but it's not what draws my absolute ire. To quote again, we support the right of parents to determine the proper medical treatment and therapy for their minor children. With all the language surrounding that, about ideas of religious convictions and the push throughout the platform against LGBT people, with the lack of specific therapies and treatments they believe are under threat here, it seems as if the specific therapy they believe parents have a right to choose for their children is so-called conversion therapy. Practices which aim to change someone's sexual orientation. Fun fact, they don't work. Fun fact, there's no evidence that they work. Fun fact, so-called ex-gays are not in fact former homosexuals. They are grifters, or they're traumatized, or they're realizing some form of bisexuality, or eventually they'll realize that they're gay again. Now, why would I assume this? Because according to NBC 15 out of Madison, Wisconsin, state Republicans blocked a conversion therapy ban and crafted a bill that would prohibit any future bans on conversion therapy by the state board overseeing therapists, counselors, and social workers. Oh hey, do you remember those judges who decided bans on conversion therapy, at least in the talk therapy form, are unconstitutional? Judges Grant and Lagoa were appointed by Trump. In their ruling, they stated that talk therapy is speech instead of medical practice, which can be regulated by the state and relevant governmental bodies. That is a ridiculous twisting that would, I think, make all forms of talk therapy not medical care and instead simply conversation and therefore not subject to any governmental oversight. You want to read someone smarter than I am explain the ridiculousness of the argument? Here's a piece published in the Harvard Law Review. Go at it. The full 11th Circuit Court denied a rehearing of the case. Of the 12 non-senior judges on the court, 6 were appointed by Trump and 1 by Bush. That gives that the majority. Though I didn't spot the exact vote breakdown, Judges Grant, Branch, and Lagoa, Trump appointees, filed a concurring opinion defending their original idea that talk therapy is not speech that can be regulated. I read through it. I also read Judge Jordan's dissent and the first little bit of Judge Rosenbaum's dissent. The dissents also happen to highlight the ridiculous attitude that talk therapy is not medical when it's carried out by licensed medical professionals in a medical environment giving you medical advice. The following states don't have conversion therapy bans for minors: Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and West Virginia. Those are any bans from what I can tell, by the way, not just on talk therapy, because supposedly parents have the right to torture their children. Now, if that is not what they mean by this section of their platform, then GOP politicians must put forward, sponsor, co-sponsor, and lobby for legislation and regulation banning the practice, with license suspensions, monetary fines, and jail time if necessary for those who do practice it. If they believe there's a First Amendment issue with talk therapy bans, then they must put forward bans on all other forms of conversion therapy for minors, at the very least. Though any practice of conversion therapy for anyone of any age is inherently harmful and goes against medical best practice and the Hippocratic Oath. If you do not think the government should respond to this abuse and torture of your fellow citizens, in which case, what is the fucking point of having a government, then you best go out and protest and lobby against all practitioners of this torture until they do not feel welcome to torture us, at least not in your community. But let me go a step further. Conversion therapy for any person of any age is wrong. It is torture. During an interview on the YouTube channel Fundy Fridays, a video titled Conversion Therapy, Liberty University, Milo, and More with Lucas Wilson, a survivor of conversion therapy, makes the case that no one should be able to choose to be tortured and have that as acceptable practice. The right not to be abused does not end when someone turns 18. You do not get some mythical right to abuse someone because they can freely choose to be tortured at your hands. To do so is still wrong, unethical, dangerous, and medical malpractice. Bans should be total bans, and anyone who is unwilling to go that far is not an ally for queer people. Now, let's go to the false assertion of support for parental rights in deciding medical care for their children. According to NPR, the leading medical organizations in the United States support gender-affirming care for trans youth. Several states, including Ron DeSantis' Florida, have decided to ban that care. Can't choose that one. Now, that makes it seem as if the platform is lying. What the GOP means to say is they support the rights of parents to make the medical decisions that the GOP agrees with. They don't care what the evidence says. They don't care what the vast majority of medical professionals say. They don't care what parents would choose for their children. That makes it incredibly clear to me that this section has nothing to do with medical choices and everything to do with the defense for the torture of LGBT youth under the guise of a practice we call conversion therapy, though there is nothing therapeutic about it. My state of Georgia recently passed a ban on gender-affirming care for youth. I attended a march protesting against that held in Savannah. I read the bill before I went because I wanted to be informed. Now, defenders of the bill, who may not have read it, might say that it simply makes sense to ban surgeries before a minor turns 18. But with the bill in Georgia, that argument is defeated by that very bill, which includes a carve-out for surgeries to be performed on minors and infants who are intersex, so that doctors may correct vague genitalia and assign a sex to that child. According to PBS, that's a practice that the UN and major human rights organizations condemn. So if we don't want irreversible surgeries on minors when they're below the age of ability to legally consent on their own, why then isn't there a ban on non-religious, non-medically necessary circumcision on infants and children? Now, I've read the so-called medical benefits to the practice in a college and class, a human sexuality class. And those who go on about the supposed benefits do this fun thing that a lot of people do with statistics, where they quote a much higher percentage risk of whatever, while failing to note the actual numbers of cases and actual percentages overall that occur either way. In the vast majority of cases, circumcision is a purely cosmetic, irreversible genital surgery done on a child who, by the GOP's own logic, isn't old enough to make that decision. And that's the platform, accepted by Donald Trump twice, the document that has driven anti-LGBT legislation and actions by the GOP ever since 2016. To stand against the rights of gay and trans people is to actively engage in homophobia and transphobia. That is what the Republican Party is. And now, it's time to go back to that dog whistle. Natural law. The GOP platform, as a refresher, says this: only a Republican president will appoint judges who respect the rule of law expressed within the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, including the inalienable right to life and the laws of nature and nature's God. Now, you may cry foul here, with that one being a phrase lifted from the Declaration, and two being a different thing than what I called it, natural law. So let's briefly go over what laws of nature are and why they don't apply here, and so we can therefore assume that what they mean is actually so-called natural law. According to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, laws of nature are physical or metaphysical laws that describe or prescribe factual truths about the universe depending on which school of thought your laws of nature theorist ascribes to. So as the article says, laws of nature have to satisfy at least 5 conditions. They're factual instead of logical, they're true across all space-time, have no proper names, must be universal or statistical in nature, and they're conditional. So if an atom has 8 protons, then it is an atom of oxygen, is a law of nature. You can view those laws as descriptive or prescriptive depending upon your view of blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that laws of nature are factual truths that must be true and cannot be broken. Legal laws and moral laws can be broken and therefore cannot be called laws of nature in the philosophical understanding of that term. And that was a long-winded way to say I believe that, at least as far as the platform of the Republican Party stands, the laws of nature and nature's God refers to an understanding of natural law. Natural law adherents tend to love one special man, St. Thomas Aquinas, namesake for a Catholic ministry at my alma mater whom I hate. I have a particular distaste for it. Natural law adherents believe in a thing called objective morality. That, like laws of nature, there are actual moral facts that can be known. Natural law also attempts to assert itself as self-evident through an appeal to general human instincts to morality. Say humans in general have a conscience across the planet and time that has oriented us to find that, in general, murder of our fellow humans is a moral wrong that should be legislated against. That generalized instinct toward good, as a natural law adherent might refer to it, is evidence in their minds of objective moral truth, for which religion and philosophy exist to attempt to discover. This also means that natural law, the instinct towards it, is reliant on our ability as human beings to apply reason. That is why we're held to morality that's not applicable to animals. A wolf which kills and eats a fox has done no moral wrong. A spider which kills and eats its young has done no moral wrong. A human who has killed and eaten its young has, we determine through our vast use of reason, committed a grave act. So, natural law does not simply mean occurring in nature. In a 1998 article for the Creighton Law Review, Natural Law, Homosexual Conduct, in the Public Policy exception, Raymond B. Marson says, "Other conceptions of natural law theory have arisen in recent generation, but it was the fully developed theory of St. Thomas Aquinas, explicated by his 16th and 17th century followers, that held sway in the era in which the early common law was being formulated. It is that theory that is rightly regarded as classic natural law jurisprudence, and it was that theory that informed the early common law decisions declaring homosexual conduct to be contrary to the law of nature." He goes on to explain that to Aquinas, heterosexual marriage is a rational moral good because it leads to harmony, love, all of that, and for the well-being and raising of offspring, a supposed instinct of all animals, including humans, which is wrong, but let's go with it. So affairs are wrong because potential children will be hurt by whatever hidden machinations or broken relationships result. Non-procreative sex is wrong because it presents some sort of harm to a potential child, which is also a wild claim because there is no potential child, but I guess not existing is a harm. So then homosexual acts in marriage are wrong because they cannot create children. No, there's no concept that certain groups of trans people in gay relationships might bear and raise children in the way that he deems of, because of course. So I'm not going to argue the morals against natural law moralists, not on their grounds. They're homophobic. On the face of it. Many natural law adherents view objective morality as their brand of religion, so it's likely that adherents in a model state would create a theocracy, which is an inherently fascist, wrong, bad goal. Regardless of if laws of nature, nature's God, refers to natural laws put forward by thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, that's a very brief overview of what that means. In his paper arguing against natural law theorists and their homophobic legal theories, Dr. Brent L. Pickett writes in Natural Law and the Regulation of Sexuality, a Critique, for the Richmond Journal of Law and the Public Interest, "Today, natural law theory offers the most common intellectual defense for the differential treatment of gays and lesbians. Leading natural law theorists such as John Finnish, Robert George, and Richard Duncan have eagerly inserted themselves into debates about law and sexuality. If their arguments are sound, it is permissible to treat gay and lesbians differently as a matter of law. Natural law theorists defend a range of policies in this regard, from anti-sodomy laws to allowing persons to discriminate against gays and lesbians in employment and housing, to a fierce opposition to same-sex unions or, in their watered-down version, civil unions. In general, natural law theorists believe that it is rational for the state to discourage homosexuality through such policies." Now surely, if that interpretation of natural law theorists is correct, and the GOP is advocating for a homophobic natural law in jurists, we would see that in other instances of their platform. For instance, they might want to overturn Obergefell and Windsor. They might view state discouragement of homosexuality as perhaps allowing and implicitly endorsing conversion therapy. They might oppose interpretations of law and new legislation that would prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. All of which they did. In a piece for the Federalist Society, Cody Cooper seems to argue, as far as I can tell, that an originalist reading of the Constitution would require an understanding of the founders' reliance on natural law, especially in regards to the Establishment Clause. He uses this argument to put forward his belief that the court should side with a Catholic adoption agency in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia in ruling unconstitutional provision made by the city that contracts for adoption could not go to those who discriminate against protected classes, including LGBT people. The court ultimately did rule in favor of the petitioners, but in a more narrow way than Cooper seems to have wanted, and mostly based on a weird exemption policy the city was doing through their non-discrimination bid in the first place. Which, why? So in other words, here's a conservative using past prescribers of natural law to argue that religious organizations should have exemptions to non-discrimination laws. That argument, that the natural law understanding that the founders had is integral to originalism, it seems to me, is how natural law legal theory persists in the courts today, regardless of whether the justices themselves call their general legal theory to be a natural law legal theory. Substantive due process and implied fundamental rights come into issue with this. A lot of conservative jurors hate substantive due process in the first place, but they've come to this fun compromise position, some of them, that it's okay in the cases of rights held in the nation's tradition and history. If the right to marriage is a fundamental right in the broad, it makes sense to say, well, according to that being a fundamental right, not allowing certain U.S. adult citizens to participate in it because of their sex is a clear denial of their fundamental rights and dignity. But if you interpret it strictly through the lens of a historical natural law, being gay is icky, so there's no need to give them rights. States have a legitimate governmental interest in discriminating against gay people. Marriage is a good because of children, which we all know is a nonsense argument because infertile couples are well within their rights to get married. No married couple is required to have children. Let's get back to that sentence from the platform though. After the mention of the laws of nature and nature's God, it says, as the late Justice Antonin Scalia did. Well, what did Antonin Scalia do? In 1996, 2 years before I was born, Scalia dissented in Romer v. Evans, a case that overturned a Colorado effort that said explicitly queer people should never be covered by anti-discrimination laws. In his dissent, Scalia asserts that it's very reasonable for people to hold a moral animus against homosexuality, and that anti-discrimination laws that explicitly protect queer people are giving us special rights, rather than just simply saying that discrimination based on sexual orientation, like many other traits generally not chosen, is wrong. Scalia dissented in 2003 in Lawrence v. Texas, the ruling that overturned sodomy laws, the case that made it so consenting gay adults can have intercourse legally across the country. I was 5 years old. He said he doesn't really care about gay people, but it's not bigotry to openly despise queer people and view being queer as a harmful, disgusting practice. He would have kept the law. Further, he put a fun little argument that has always been used to argue against advancements in queer rights. It cannot be discrimination because straight people who would not want to are not allowed to engage in that activity. So obviously a ban on same-sex intimacy can't be discriminatory against gay people because the straighties also can't have the gay sex. With no groups being targeted. Well, it's nonsense. It's saying, hey, if you don't want to be criminalized, why don't you just go and have straight sex? Why don't you marry someone of the opposite sex? Hey, remember that whole spiel about the current platform and conversion therapy? I imagine Scalia would be a fan. And isn't that also like an anti-miscegenation defense on interracial marriage and relations? United States v. Windsor, 2013, the case that struck down the part of the Defense of Marriage Act that had the federal government unable to recognize same-sex marriages regardless of the marital acceptance or status in the state performed. If a marriage occurs, say in New York, as it did, and the state acknowledges and accepts it, but the federal government treats it as if it doesn't exist, well, Scalia is fine with that. I was 15. Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015, gay marriage legalized. I was 17. Social media flooded with people I knew in my small Kentucky town decrying the biblical end time. Scalia, of course, dissented. He insulted the majority opinion as basically a gobbledygook. He goes into a high-minded rant about how marriage discrimination is historic and therefore obviously a just and moral take. He said the decision questioned the legitimacy and power of the court. Well, how about in 2012, before Windsor, after Lawrence? Well, according to Slate, he said, "If we cannot have moral feelings against homosexuality, can we have it against murder?" Which translates to, if it's wrong for me to be bigoted, then it's wrong for us to not allow murder. He acknowledges that it's an absurd argument, but he doesn't seem to get that that doesn't reflect well on him. He also seems to indicate that in 2012, when I was 14, he would have ruled still in favor of banning gay sex. Justice Antonin Scalia was a homophobe, and a platform that advocates for discrimination against queer people, for revocation of our right to marriage, for the rights of other people to torture the queer out of us. It only makes sense to invoke Justice Scalia to indicate all their hearty woes and wishes to harm LGBT people across the country. But, you might say, he's dead! He did other things, and sure, the platform itself, expounded and approved by the party and its nominee, might be explicitly and implicitly extremely queerphobic, and sure, maybe the three most recognizable names in the primary are rallying against us in homophobic and transphobic rhetoric and policy, but surely, as those original tweets said, we misunderstand conservatives, so I guess perhaps you aren't properly represented by your presidential candidates, by your party platform, or by the judicial hero of the party. So, who are the major names of the GOP, and where do they stand? Big name Republicans. Mike Pence, Vice President to the Trump administration. 2016, People unearthed a 2000 campaign website wherein, after discussing his opinion on congressional funding for patients with HIV/AIDS, the website said, resources should be directed towards those institutions which provide assistance to those seeking to change their sexual behavior. According to the New York Times, his spokesperson at the time went, no, he meant safe sex practices. Now this might be weird, but follow me here. What organizations provide psychological relief to help people choose to use condoms? Do you know of any dedicated to that? I don't. But I do know that I have spent enough time online since people have debated gay marriage as far back as 2012 using that phrasing of seeking to change their sexual behavior to refer to conversion therapy. It's still used on Twitter if you look at Side B and Side X Christians and how they talk about gay people needing to be celibate or straight, or at least straight married for God. Now I know therapies for sex addiction and the like, perhaps. But what really puts that over the top for me is the platform that this administration, which he was part of, helped to craft and approve, and it carried an endorsement for conversion therapy. Speaking of, thanks to the Internet Archive, I found a post of his from 2007 which says, finally, pro-homosexual activist groups such as the Human Rights Campaign have stated their belief that an ad campaign by pro-family groups showing that many former homosexual people had found happiness in a heterosexual lifestyle contributed to the tragic 1998 murder of homosexual college student Matthew Shepard. However, the danger here is that people use a hate crimes bill to silence the freedom of religious leaders to speak out against homosexuality. Now, for my purposes here, I'm not really interested in investigating the motivation of the barbaric killing of Matthew Shepard. What interests me is the wording before then. Besides contrasting pro-homosexual with pro-family, and thereby implying that the two concepts are completely at odds with each other, Pence here simply accepts the premise. Conversion therapy ad campaigns truly do show what they purport to show. Gay people being happy through living as if they're straight. He also calls sexuality a lifestyle. That seems to me to be further evidence of his support for conversion therapy, especially since he then seems to imply that conversion therapy is simple, good religious speech and advocacy. Now, advocating for conversion therapy is probably, unfortunately, free speech. That is true. But there's no indication here that he's against conversion therapy in any way, shape, or form. In 2010, on John King USA, then Congressman Pence argued against repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the policy that prevented members of the U.S. military from coming out of the closet without being discharged. Pence argued that some soldiers he talked to didn't want that. And obviously, the homophobia of random people should dictate military policy, while implicating that allowing openly queer people to serve would somehow be against the interest of national security. That makes me think of all of those implications that allowing gay marriage would somehow be the destruction of civil society. It's all connected. You may recall Nikki Haley talking about military preparedness in regards to trans people. On a similar note, in 2004, while arguing for the Protect Marriage Act, which would restrict courts from being allowed to consider the constitutionality of the part of DOMA, which allows states to not recognize same-sex marriages from other states, or even consider the law itself, Pence claimed marriage was under attack by activist judges. A case he pointed to as an attack and blueprint for the supposed downfall of marriage? Lawrence v. Texas. One can imply from that he opposed that ruling, though he doesn't say right out here that he thinks queer intimacy should be illegal. At the start of 2015, Pence, then governor of Indiana, signed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act that opponents said would be used to discriminate against queer people. And certain supporters claimed adding non-discrimination clarification would ruin the point of the bill. Pence defended the bill over and over, though he also, to his credit, readily signed a follow-up bill that clarified it does not allow for-profit corporations or individuals to discriminate against people, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That came after intense backlash. In a 2022 interview with NPR, he seems to indicate a slight annoyance that the state was forced to do that, though without saying he doesn't think it was the wrong move. He says the original bill didn't allow for discrimination, though from the legal analyses that I read and from how certain supporters reacted to the clarification of the bill, that certainly was the original intention. In that same interview, he supports the Trump trans military ban, still in 2022, implying that allowing trans people in the military would mess with unit cohesion. It was the same nonsense argument that he made for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He immediately pivots instead of expanding on that thought, though he eventually circles back to it and says the military should stay focused on defending the nation. There's a sort of implication there that allowing trans people to serve would cripple and weaken the military. That's a nonsense statement. It's a transphobic statement. It doesn't make any sense. Interestingly, I will say Pence has taken a very more mainstream, from what I gather, homophobic Republican view on marriage recently. That being, according to an interview with CBS, that though he personally views it as morally wrong, which, to be clear, makes him a homophobe regardless of what else he says, he doesn't make a case to overturn Obergefell. Instead, he talks about balancing religious freedom, which generally means letting religious people discriminate, which is bad, and that the nation needs to move forward. That implies to me that he doesn't want to continue to litigate same-sex marriage or campaign on it because it's a losing issue. Though, of course, we haven't seen him decide to run for office again yet and make specific policy prescriptions on a website. So I also acknowledge that there's a chance this is simply a statement that he says to take away pressure from his homophobia. He does say he disagrees with the ruling in Obergefell still, though. That, to me, says he thinks states have a right to discriminate against queer people when it comes to the arenas of fundamental rights such as marriage. Which leads me to say that his homophobic beliefs led him to oppose the Respect for Marriage Act, which expressly changed the part of the law that the Protect Marriage Act sought to protect. If Obergefell, God forbid, gets overturned, states will be required by federal law to recognize and not discriminate against same-sex marriages done by other states. According to the Daily Signal, were he in Congress, he would vote against it, because he is still a bigot, no matter how statesmanly he attempts to dress and hide his horrid views. Thanks to the American Presidency Project at UC Santa Barbara, I got to read through a speech that Vice President Pence made in 2017 at a celebratory event for a little organization known as Focus on the Family. While it seems he was mostly there to hype up the administration's commitment to being anti-choice and its desire to repeal Obamacare, he went out of his way to praise the organization on its then 40 years. He said, "And it's a privilege to be here on this historic day, the 40th anniversary of a cornerstone of American life for so many Americans, an organization that has been a champion without equal for American families, a bastion of grace that has inspired millions with your model of Christian love." He also said, "I'm really here today on the president's behalf to congratulate Focus on the Family's 40 years of visions, 40 years of compassion, and most of all, I'm here today to congratulate Focus on the Family for 40 years of consequence for faith in families all across these United States." He specifically goes on to praise founder and former leader, Dr. James Dobson. Before his election loss in 2020, Pence also appeared on a Focus on the Family broadcast, which I read the transcript for. It includes more praise for their organization and Dobson. There's a lot of talk about the vague idea of family. There's also a moment where the interviewer decides to bring up religious liberty and the like. And one thing that he specifically mentions is faith-based adoption agencies and the recent apparent vitriol they face. This seems to clearly be a reference to those adoption agencies that want to be able to enjoy government contracts and federal monies whilst discriminating against queer people. Pence responds to it by talking about the Trump administration removing barriers, as they say, and letting them participate in providing services, whether that be shelter, whether that be adoption services. They seem to be careful to avoid flat out saying we should be allowed to discriminate. So for my last bit on Pence, though, like with Trump, there's still plenty more to talk about, and I've not gotten into his blatant transphobia in general. For my last bit, let's get into why that praise for Focus on the Family and James Dobson is a clear and disgusting mark of homophobia against both him, Trump, and every other conservative who praises them. Focus on the Family. Founded in 1977 by James Dobson, a major force in conservative evangelical politics. An article posted in 2022 responding to a transgender identified family member tells people to maybe use someone's preferred name, but definitely don't use their preferred pronouns. It also says that being trans is a sexual thing, which simply is not true. Gender and sexuality are not the same thing by any means. They suggest telling someone, hey, we love you, but we're scared to have our kids around you because we want them to be hateful bigots, and you're getting in the way of that. Oh, and some biological essentialism of how men and women should behave, of course. It's genetically coded how we should act. They have a Q&A document I read through which says, hey, don't be aggressive and cruel, which, thanks, I do appreciate that. But it suggests confronting schools. It suggests that the schools are infected and are infecting children with being trans. A social contagion theory, which is not real and is legitimately Nazi rhetoric about LGBT people. It says to confront schools about it. Conflates gender identity with sexual activity again, suggests a connection with being trans and being autistic or abused, lists mental health issues and plays an innocent dunce, oh, who can tell whether those cause or are caused by being trans, when the answer actually is that LGBT people exhibit such mental health issues partially because people are not affirming and are cruel. Because governments and politicians and religions fight against our rights, call us pedophiles and tell us we're abominations to God. That is what causes those high levels of mental illness. They know that, though. Every idiot who brings this up knows that non-affirming people are why those mental health issues exist at such rates. But they call us dramatic when we point it out to them because they don't want to admit it. They have to play stupid so they don't have to come to the fact that they are harming people. Now, obviously, there are a million of these. I can't do them all. In a Q&A titled Responding to Teen Child Who Says He's Gay, Focus gives advice that pretty much amounts to gaslight the hell out of your kid. Question him, get him to question himself, try to get him to stop identifying as gay and instead as someone with same-sex attraction. It's just talking about how God would hate it if he ever got in a loving same-sex relationship, because they're spiritually and emotionally abusive. It says there's hope if he's confused, struggling, or ashamed, but otherwise he's uncompromising, as if there's a compromise to be reached on an unchanging part. There isn't. They tell you to talk it out with a counselor, but only if they're an anti-gay Christian counselor. They then have a list of resources that you can go to. On that list of resources is a link to a video called Love One Out, Someone I Love is Gay by Thriving Values. In a section towards the end, the speaker, Jeff Johnston, who the video says works at Focus on the Family, suggests people look into Exodus International, among other ex-gay ministry nonsense. It's telling parents and loved ones to start looking at trying to stick their kids into conversion therapy. Fun fact about that man, he also wrote a pamphlet thing for Focus on the Family called Understanding Male Homosexuality, where at the end he quotes an ex-gay group that says the goal in true understanding and hope is that people realize they're part of God's heterosexual creation and should be healed and act in that. He has a quote from someone which says, "No one is really gay." Now you might hear that and think, oh, so Focus on the Family is a hate group that advocates for torture. And you would be right. Love One Out, part of the title of that gross video, is actually a former thing. A thing launched by Focus on the Family in 1998, the year that I was born, known as an ex-gay ministry. In other words, a group dedicated to the harassment of and torture of queer people. It was eventually bought by Exodus International, another horrid conversion therapy spiritual abuse group. People involved in leadership of both groups since the dissolution of Exodus, and therefore the death of the former one, have come out and rightfully apologized for the pain they have inflicted on countless queer people throughout the years. But Focus on the Family, who founded Love One Out, did not apologize. In fact, a lot of anti-queer hate groups, pro-torture abusers, joined a different network. That network is called Restored Hope. Now, you might be a little curious. You might be wondering, gee, I wonder who's on the board, specifically the board of reference, whatever the hell that means. On that board, you have current president of Focus on the Family, Jim Daly. You also have Hateful Butter Man, Dr. James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, which all comes together to make Focus on the Family effectively an ex-gay ministry itself. A bigoted hate group that masks its hate under its version of Christianity whilst advocating against LGBT rights and advocating for our psychological and emotional torture under the false belief that you can fix us. Something that has no evidence to back it up. That is the group Mike Pence, and by extension Donald Trump, decided to lavish in praise. That is the group founded by James Dobson, Mike Pence's hero. So, let's talk about that piece of shit. James Dobson, besides being the founder of Focus on the Family and supporter of conversion torture on queer people, Dobson wrote an article in Time magazine called Two Mommies is One Too Many, where he decries Mary Cheney's pregnancy and plans to raise the kid with her wife. He says that this isn't about politics, but the children. It's a familiar talking point, isn't it? It's almost as if Dobson and Focus on the Family are influential to the right wing in their ability to peddle and mask their bigoted views and hatred. He claims, falsely because he doesn't care about facts, that children are worse off when raised by same-sex parents, and that same-sex parents raising children will damage the nation. Sounds strikingly familiar to the GOP's platform language, implying that gay marriage will destroy civilization. And what does Dobson consider good parenting? Beating the shit out of your kids and demanding loyalty. Suddenly, those articles from Focus on the Family about dealing with LGBT children make a bit more sense. That's why they direct parents to ex-gay conversion torture bullshit, because it's fine to harm your children into submission. They say to make sure to love and be a loving experience in your child's life while encouraging gaslighting and spiritual abuse, because it was founded by a defender of child abuse. Shocking. But it's about the children. After all, in his book Marriage Under Fire, Why We Must Win This Battle, Dobson says gay marriage will destroy families, hurt kids, prevent us from being able to happily discriminate like Christ would want. The world might become more accepting of queer people, and God will exert his apocalyptical wrath on the planet. After all, that's what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, isn't it? It's not. Legitimately, even if you are a member of an Abrahamic religion, being gay is not the sin of Sodom. Read the story. I mean, don't. It's not a fun read. None of the Bible is, but at least read it if you're going to use it as an excuse to claim we'll cause the downfall of civilization. Now, you may be thinking, doesn't being against gay marriage because it means people in governmental services won't be able to discriminate make one a bigot? Yes, it does, because Dobson is a bigot. Dobson didn't only found Focus, support conversion torture of queer people, and lie/misrepresent studies to oppose LGBT rights and adoption. He also founded another organization that, once upon a time, was part of Focus on the Family, a little conservative group designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, called the Family Research Council. So, I guess that means, oopsies, there's another section to hit here to cover how disgusting it is to celebrate James Dobson. The Family Research Council, you might have heard of it. It's a conservative evangelical lobbying group that was instrumental in getting Roe v. Wade overturned. Now why would the SPLC designate such a poor group of well-meaning Christian conservatives as a hate group? Well, that would be because the FRC has and continues to push a narrative that LGBT people pose a danger to children, are more likely to sexually assault a child, and are out to groom children and demand acceptance for pedophilia. Now, when you hear that, you might pause for a moment. You might think, wait, that sounds familiar. That argument, you might think, is the argument used by Ron DeSantis and his supporters for the Don't Say Gay bill. That's what his former press secretary said of opponents of the bill. That's the argument put forth by provocateur and stochastic terrorist libs of TikTok. I read through the SPLC's page on the group. They quoted many members of and articles from the FRC. So I'll give you some highlights. 2022. So when did religious freedom become an excuse to discriminate? From the beginning. 2019. The demands of transgender supremacy deflect much-needed resources away from the pandemic of autism. Also, by the way, eugenicist language comparing autism diagnoses to a pandemic is extremely out of pocket. 2019. For years, LGBT activists wanted to keep the goal of luring children into sexual confusion under wraps. 2018, about marriage equality. It's about obliterating every moral and cultural boundary humans have ever known. There's an I identify as a tech helicopter type joke. There's a statement that mental health issues amongst LGBT people is on the fault of us being LGBT and not on unaffirming policies and people, which is the actual source. That it's unnatural. That gay men are more likely to abuse children. That gay families adopt kids specifically to sexually assault them. You get the picture. The point of pushing this rhetoric is to allow people to not give us rights and to ask them to commit violence on us. The FRC and Focus filed an amicus brief in Lawrence v. Texas. Guess what side they argued? If you guessed the side of criminalizing gay sex, you would be correct. They call it an evil and deviant act that states might have a vested interest in restricting. Current president of FRC, Tony Perkins, in 2018, still argued against the Lawrence decision, calling it a mistake that led to gay marriage and therefore a moment on the path to the destruction of human history. He quotes Scalia's slippery slope argument that says, if we can't ban the gays, then how can we ban bestiality? One of the first results on the featured resources on sexuality of the FRC's website is an article claiming that sexual orientation is something that can be changed, which is, you guess it, tacit approval of employing conversion torture against LGBT people, and it is also incorrect. They also issued briefs in Windsor and Obergefell arguing against gay marriage, of course. That should be it, shouldn't it? James Dobson founded two vastly influential anti-LGBT hate groups that have unflinching grips on the conservative movement. While unfortunately comedy is not the only thing that comes in threes. Because now it's time to talk about one more organization James Dobson helped found. The so-called Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom. So the ADF is mostly a legal group. They take up court cases and endorse candidates, they lobby for laws, etc., etc. The ADF started a fun little school protest event called Day of Truth to oppose Day of Silence protests that pointed out anti-LGBT bullying in schools. Now, why would that be their response? Probably because they want to bully LGBT kids, but also don't want to be labeled a bully for doing that bullying. Now, thanks to the Internet Archive, I read a Q&A from the Day of Truth website. They say the ADF launched the project, but guess who ended up taking over? That's right, Ex-Gay Torture Society, Exodus International. They also go on to argue for a Christian natural rights understanding of both morality and the Constitution, and that includes the apparent truth that LGBT people are icky and should be bullied and are wrong and against God. Okay. So maybe the ADF supports people bullying LGBT children, but surely elsewise they want to protect children, right? And that must be why they took up the case of Brian Tingley, a counselor who ran afoul of Washington law by doing conversion therapy on minors. Now, Brian's conversion therapy is talk therapy. So if you remember that court case I mentioned where the 11th Circuit decided that talk therapy is not medical care and therefore cannot be regulated. A ridiculous conclusion that basically claims talk therapy is useless and thereby should receive no credit or respect. Well, that logic is the logic put forth by the ADF on their website where they talk about Tingley's case, Tingley v. Ferguson, which it wants SCOTUS to take up because they rightfully lost in the 9th Circuit. In other words, the ADF wants SCOTUS to rule that Christians have a right to commit children to mental, emotional, and spiritual torture that does not work, and which studies have shown harm the people who go through it. Isn't that just lovely? Their website still says that gay marriage subjects women, children, and the underprivileged to distress. They say that gay marriage is inherently selfish, much like how Ron Perry's Christian nationalist group, The Gathering, calls trans people hedonistic, because all of these groups are interconnected in their underlying commitment to exerting a boot onto the backs of people under the name of asceticism for all but only them. They say that gay marriage will destroy society and imply adoption is disgusting. On their page talking about parental rights, they call the inclusion of sexual orientation, gender identity, and race as horrible things that schools are teaching. Now, one can conclude, based on their statements against gay people, their alliance with Exodus, their founding by Dobson, and founding of protests to support the bullying of LGBT children, that when the ADF says harmful lessons, what they mean is that schools aren't putting out a moral screed against LGBT people. And it might even express accepting attitudes or, God forbid, acknowledge that queer people exist. They say schools are encouraging kids to be transing the kids, one might say, when that's not a thing. Schools might be accepting, and they deride that schools don't then turn around and out children to their parents. Listen, I'm sorry, parents, but whether or not a child comes out to you is up to the child, not you. Not the school, not anyone. It is up to your child. Oh, and they defend adoption and foster care agencies discriminating against people on religious homophobia and transphobia grounds, because religion apparently trumps civil rights. Fun fact, on their page arguing against their designation as a hate group by the SPLC, they say they don't support conversion therapy. They just support the rights of people to conduct conversion therapy, and that's totally different, you guys. They just don't want bans on conversion therapy. Reasonable people sign up to be tortured or send their children to get tortured. They support conversion therapy. Elsewise, they'd have never interacted with Exodus International. They wouldn't take up the Tingley case. Get fucked, ADF. They filed a brief in Lawrence v. Texas in favor of sodomy laws, which claimed what the court should actually consider is whether it is reasonable to believe that same-sex sodomy is a distinct public health problem. It clearly is. Speaking of Lawrence, their global version praised India's recriminalization of homosexuality, saying, "India chose to protect society at large rather than give in to a vocal minority of homosexual advocates." Which to me says they're lying when they claim on their website that they do not want the US to recriminalize being LGBT. They support it when India does it. They definitely supported it at home. They argued in favor of a funeral home that fired an employee for being trans in RG and GR Harris Funeral Homes, Inc. versus Equal Employment Opportunity, arguing regular employers are and should be allowed to discriminate against trans people and, by extension, LGBT people as a whole. That case was decided alongside Bostock. They lost, obviously. There's more, but I think that's enough. The ADF is all over the conservative movement, and it has the filth of James Dobson all over it. These are the organizations that Trump and Pence decided to praise, and that is the man that Pence idolized. And now let's move on to some other Republicans. Mitch McConnell, senator from Kentucky, current Senate Minority Leader, soon to be retired. He appointed Tony Perkins, head of the hate group Family Research Council, to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, probably to award him for being a notorious bigot heading a hate group. He voted against repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He defended the discriminatory section of the Defense of Marriage Act. He disagreed with Obergefell, of course. He voted against the Respect for Marriage Act. When he was majority leader, he refused to take up or allow a vote on the Equality Act that would have prohibited discrimination against LGBT people, placing language to that effect in the Civil Rights Act. He voted against the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. He's endorsed by the Family Research Council in 2020. The Human Rights Campaign puts out scorecards evaluating people's voting records in Congress. His score is 117th Congress 14, 116th Congress 0, 115th 0, 114th 20, 113th 0, 112th 0, 111th 0, 110th 0. So since 2007, he scored a total of 34 points out of 800. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina. Now first, I want to say that I'm not going to go into the rumors about Graham and his proclivities. I understand the pointing out of hypocrisy and why people do it. But the way a lot of his critics gleefully run to that line of attacks against him, I get it, but it gives me the ick. There's something dark to me about the idea that we choose whether or not to be homophobic or femphobic based on someone's politics. That's part of why I'm uncomfortable with my fellow queers using the F slur against each other, not in a reclamatory way, but as a slur. I'm sorry. If you use a slur as a slur, you are not reclaiming it, you are simply using it. Calling someone a slur whom you do not have a rapport with and or who has not expressed an acceptance for being called that is simply cruel. It's part of why, for instance, when I hear someone express discomfort with being called queer as an umbrella term because they have experience with it being used as a slur, as long as they're not using that experience as an attack on their fellow LGBT plus siblings, I can't hold that against them. With that out of the way, let's briefly talk about Lindsey Graham. Graham voted against overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell by claiming that it would increase casualties, which is a ridiculous statement. Oh damn, this guy's gay. This knowledge has destroyed all of my training, preparedness, and abilities. If people being gay destroys the effectiveness of the military, it's not an effective military in the first place. When asked by a constituent about protecting his and other LGBT South Carolinians' rights, according to Out magazine, Graham mentioned the binding ruling of SCOTUS, defended religious homophobes from the label of bigot, and said, "I've tried to be tolerant. When it comes to South Carolina, I think I've been an effective voice for who we are." Now, I have tried to be tolerant to me sounds off-putting. It implies I'm doing my best not to tell you how disgusting I find you and how much I wish society would go to act to a point where your rights were not the law of the land. His record is opposing LGBT rights. Though, to give him some small credit, according to a New York One article, Graham said that he doesn't agree with Justice Thomas that the Dobbs ruling calls LGBT rights cases into question. Though, he also said that he still believes the issue should be left up to the states, as he believes apparently that civil rights should be up to the voters to decide. Lindsey does not believe himself in same-sex marriage, obviously. He voted against the Respect for Marriage Act. Lindsey signed onto an amicus brief supporting the rights of religious adoption agencies to discriminate against LGBT people. He voted no on a law that would ban employment discrimination for LGBT people. He was endorsed by anti-gay hate group Family Research Council, and here are his Human Rights Campaign scores. 117th Congress 16, 116th Congress 0, 115th 12, 114th 24, 113th 0, 112th 15, 111th 13, 110th 0. Total score 80 out of 800. Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, cucked Donald Trump. He's gross, so let's go through this quickly. He was endorsed by anti-gay hate group Family Research Council. He voted against the Respect for Marriage Act. He voted against the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. He was endorsed by notorious bigot and LGBT hate monger James Dobson for the 2016 primary. While speaking at the Texas GOP convention in 2022, he claimed LGBT people are going after children and that children's media should not include us in any way, claiming that we're after the destruction of America. Oh, you poor little country, I'm going to destroy you. That convention, by the way, resulted in the state GOP platform including sections calling homosexuality an abominable lifestyle choice, says they oppose all efforts to validate transgender identity, and include support for fucking conversion therapy, because of course it does. I find it very telling that Cruz spoke about defending the children at a conference with a platform that explicitly defends the torture of LGBT children. Do not know what influence senators have over their state platforms, and they might not have any, to be fair, but the lack of response about that part of the platform whilst he was there says he cares more about his bigotry than he does children. He signed on to a brief in Fulton defending the idea that religious people should be allowed to discriminate against LGBT people. In 2023, Cruz still opposes Obergefell and marriage equality, though he thinks it might not get overturned because it could cause an administrative headache. According to a Vanity Fair article, Cruz looked at opposition to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill and, I'm assuming in a joking way, said that Disney's opposition means it wants to show kids weird hentai or Mickey and Pluto having sex. He also implies having queer people on children's TV is inherently scandalous and sexual. It's not innocuous. The implication, of course, is that we are grooming pedophiles, and acknowledging our existence around children is the same as showing them porn. Here are his HRC scorecards. 117th Congress, 0, 116th, 0, 115th, 0, 114th, 0, 113th, 20. That's a total of 20 out of 500. SCOTUS. Let's talk about conservative members of the Supreme Court. Now, I will say in general that I think judges might not and maybe ought not to use their personal views to shape the ways that they rule. There's a reason that people call themselves originalists or textualists or whatnot, and few outright call themselves naturalists or natural law legal theorists. But I also think we can take general trends amongst rulings and the ways in which opinions are written to determine whether or not a justice's personal biases come into play. Justice Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas called sodomy law silly, but he still dissented in Lawrence v. Texas because he doesn't believe in the right to privacy, or I guess equal protection, or anything. But he would totally have voted to repeal the law, yeah, of course. He also joined in on Scalia's dissent in that case. He dissented in Obergefell v. Hodges. In 2020, he called Kim Davis a victim of the Obergefell decision because she wanted to discriminate against gay people, and the government said, no, you can't do that. He joined in on Alito's dissent in Bostock v. Clayton County, arguing that prohibiting sex discrimination does not prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, despite the obvious logical conclusion that it is. He joined in on Scalia's dissent in Windsor v. United States, as well as in Alito's dissent. His concurrence in Dobbs said the court should reconsider Obergefell and other LGBT rights cases. Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Before her time on the court, according to the AP, Barrett served on the board of Trinity Schools Incorporated, a group of private Christian schools that actively discriminated against LGBT people in hiring and apparently made it clear to students and prospective students that queer people are not welcome there. I did not find any statements that implied Barrett in any way argued against those policies or has publicly spoken on them at all. Trinity Schools, much like Barrett herself, is associated with People of Praise, a religious group that she belongs to. She's a Catholic, if you didn't know, that the group is not strictly Catholic. In that same AP article, there are recollections of members of People of Praise praying that some gay family members would simply stop being gay. One said he was forced into conversion therapy and that he was also counseled by a senior People of Praise leader that same-sex attraction was changeable with treatment and prayer. Others state that the group holds a strict side B Christianity, that gay people can be gay so long as they don't do anything about it, though it honestly seems like they're probably actually side X. One woman was kicked out and her family shunned after she came out. People of Praise declines those accusations or claims they're inaccurate. When Coney Barrett's nomination was being debated, conservatives called objections that look towards her religious and personal beliefs as an anti-Catholic bias. So fine, I'll come out and say it. I don't respect your religious beliefs if they're bigoted. If your religion tells you that marriage is only between a man and a woman, your religion is homophobic. If your religious beliefs say that being gay or trans is either a choice or a result of the fall, your religious beliefs are bigoted. Racism does not become defensible because the person who has it disguises their bigotry in religion. Homophobia and transphobia are not suddenly beyond reproach because they are arrived at via religion. It is more than reasonable to look at religious beliefs that call for discrimination against queer people, that call our existences incorrect, and use that to establish whether or not someone is a bigot themselves. If Coney Barrett believes, the people of faith seem to, that gay people must be celibate and that being and acting on being gay is wrong, then she is an anti-LGBT bigot. But her God says that, someone might say. Then her God is a bigot. Any Christian theological view which is not firmly side A, also known as the affirming position, is a homophobic theology. That goes for any religion. Islamic homophobia, Thelemic homophobia, Buddhist, whatever, it's still homophobia, it's still transphobia, and it's still wrong. Something being a religious belief does not mean it is beyond critique, examination, or even shunning. During her confirmation hearings, though she apologized for it and said she meant no offense, Coney Barrett repeatedly referred to sexual orientation as sexual preference. Now, for those of you who may not be hyper-vigilant to homophobia, that might not necessarily strike you as anything odd. But the word preference, it implies a choice. The implication that it is a choice is then taken that it's able to be chosen away from, that it might change, that it could be a moral evil chosen by deviance. Given the supposed beliefs of her religious group, it's not a large stretch of imagination to conclude that Coney Barrett does view sexual orientation as a moral negative, as something people can heal from, and as a choice, a preference. According to the Human Rights Campaign before her nomination, she misgendered trans women as physiological males who identify as females, which seems very close to me to the TERF version of trans-identified male. Justice Neil Gorsuch. Gorsuch, to his absolute credit, in a way that lives up to the legacy of Justice Kennedy more so than Scalia, whom he replaced, was the author of the majority opinion in Bostock, saying, Title VII protections against sex discrimination, of course, prevent discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. His pre-SCOTUS ruling in Hobby Lobby Stores Inc. v. Sibelius seems to me, though, that he might accept the Braidwood management argument that requiring coverage for PrEP violates religious freedom. On a less speculative note, in his pre-SCOTUS days, he ruled a few times against trans people, including in healthcare. Gorsuch wrote a dissenting opinion in Pavin v. Smith. At issue was an Arkansas law not allowing same-sex married partners to appear on birth certificates, despite having instances where non-biological fathers married to the mother are allowed on the certificate. The argument against was some sort of interest in medical record keeping. To be honest, Gorsuch's dissent made it seem like the case was moot because another law should have allowed the names to be placed, but then wouldn't the lawsuit be rejected on standing grounds, given that there would be no harm? What it seems like to me is some sort of twisting into saying the state has an interest in only having biological parents on the certificate, even though it has exceptions and allows for adoptive parents to be placed, which would be an excuse to not offer full protections to queer families. I don't know, it was a very odd read. It's an LGBT rights case, so I'm including it, but I'm honestly not really sure what to make of his dissent here. Justice Samuel Alito. As mentioned in the Thomas section, Alito dissented in Bostock. He joined Thomas when he wrote in 2020 that Kim Davis is a victim of the Obergefell decision because she wanted to discriminate against gay people, and the government said no. He dissented in Windsor. He dissented in Obergefell, seeming to be upset, as Scalia often was, that opponents of gay rights might now be seen as bigots, which he was correct about, because they are bigots. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, time for Mr. I Like Beer himself. His confirmation was urged by anti-LGBT hate group the Family Research Council. Much like Gorsuch's, despite my searching, there isn't much information from his pre-SCOTUS days that might indicate much on his potential rulings. A Human Rights Campaign document pointed to his time in the Bush White House in the 2000s, and his likely but unknown hand in decisions such as the push for an amendment defining marriage in a way that discriminates against LGBT people. That same document talks about his take on religious objections to healthcare for, in this case, contraceptives. This makes me think he too might be on the side of religious arguments in Braidwood management and other healthcare decisions that would allow for discrimination against queer people. He also dissented in Bostock. Chief Justice John Roberts. Chief Justice Roberts dissented in Obergefell and said that just because there's a fundamental right, it doesn't mean that the government can't decide to discriminate and choose not to extend that right. He laments the changing of a long-held tradition. He talks about how marriage is there for children. It's a natural law argument against gay marriage without outright saying he's against gay people ourselves. He argues that states have a legitimate interest in preserving traditional marriage, though besides his talk about child rearing beforehand, I don't really see what he suggests that reasoning would be. Many good and decent people oppose same-sex marriage, he says, but he's wrong. Bigots oppose same-sex marriage. Homophobes oppose same-sex marriage. He dissented in Windsor, but at the same time, he was in the majority on Bostock. The thing about jurists, I find, is that in general, unlike most politicians, they're a little bit harder to pin down. Oftentimes they rule in multiple ways on the same or incredibly similar cases and issues. They have their own understandings of law, philosophy, the Constitution, and precedent. Constitutional law itself is complicated, and that's why people spend their lives dedicated to it, and why so many who do spend their lives on it disagree. I think that leads us to both want to politicize and depoliticize the judiciary. We want to imagine the apolitical jurist, but we imagine every ruling as political, as not political. You often get desires to elect judges, and I understand that instinct, but at the same time, I look at campaigns and their position to hand out sentences and judge laws, and suddenly I imagine a much darker and stricter justice system, everyone needing to show how tough and ideological they are. Then again, now we play obfuscating games and dodge ideas of jurists possibly ruling based off of their politics. There's no way they did that, ever. I don't really have a solution or even a prescription here besides this. The courts and who are on them matters. As such, the Senate, the President, and the Senate Judiciary Committee are of utmost importance. Interlude. To break up the continuum of bigotry, I want to cut in here with resources. The Human Rights Campaign conducts research, lobbies politicians, and fights for LGBT+ rights across the country. The Trevor Project is an LGBT plus youth advocacy organization whose goal is to improve the mental health of kids and reduce suicide rates. They offer crisis support, for instance. The ACLU is the leading legal defender of civil rights in the United States, issuing legal challenges to unconstitutional laws and fighting for LGBT people. Coming right on the heels of the ACLU in legal battles and advocacy for the community, there's Lambda Legal. Advocacy group GLAD has further resources and links in the few I've mentioned. They also helped me find several of the sources I have used in this video. So, having looked at GOP presidential candidates, SCOTUS justices, and a few prominent Republicans and organizations, let's see how they square up to the state party platforms. Alabama has a very short and not very detailed platform, though for reading's sake, thank you. It says traditional marriage is the foundation of a free society, implying same-sex marriage goes against a free society, implies a desire for justices who will oppose queer rights, does not include sexual orientation or gender identity in the following sentence. We believe in equal rights, equal justice, and equal opportunity for all, without regard to race, creed, age, sex, or national origin. Implying they do support withholding that equality for LGBT persons. Alaska, where you can see Russia. The Alaskan GOP platform is a web page instead of a PDF, which I find both nice and odd. They state that marriage is between one man and one woman. They support reserving marriage benefits to this union alone, after calling the family the foundational unit of society, implying queer families aren't part of that foundation. They oppose the insertion of sexual orientation and gender identity in the list of protected classes under anti-discrimination laws for the state, which implies to me that they support people in their discrimination against LGBT people. It is language about biological males and females to avoid using trans men and trans women. It basically says trans people shouldn't be allowed to use facilities or anything else in line with their gender identity. Arizona. In a strange turn of events, I did not find a platform for Arizona. The closest thing I found was a non-specific about page, an issues page that was just a bylaws collection, and a resolutions page, which I think is the closest thing that was there in relation to a platform. There's a resolution declaring that they want to pass laws or an amendment stating only biologically DNA verifiable gender shall be upheld as legal gender. So I don't know, I guess fuck intersex people and cis people with atypical DNA. And another resolution while discussing sex acts in books and research databases as pedophilia. It says one harmful thing included amongst those awful sex acts that's obviously on the same level is homosexual marriage. So I guess me getting married one day is the same thing as showing a child porn. Arkansas. At this rate, I was getting amused by and hoping each state would have a slightly new way of presenting their platform or lack thereof. For Arkansas, their platform is on their website through Scribd. Another statement that marriage is the foundation, this time of a healthy society, and that marriage is a holy thing between one man and one woman, implying that same-sex marriage is both unholy and leads to an ill society. On their statement against discrimination, they say we should have equal opportunity to succeed regardless of race, nationality, origin, gender, or creed. They don't include sexual orientation because of course not. That implies that they don't mind and maybe even support discrimination based off sexual orientation. You may think, oh, they said gender, that's curious. Are they somehow homophobic whilst being trans-affirming? Of course not. They say they oppose federal efforts to force doctors and hospitals to treat patients according to self-perceived gender identity and insurance requirements for any related coverage. So I think they mean they're against forced affirming care, but there's also potential that they mean they support the Trump administration's take that healthcare professionals should be able to discriminate against trans people. Their platform is explicitly Christian, by the way, which is alluded to in other platforms, but it's interesting. It almost seems like one could call it a Christian nationalist party, but I'm not sure I'd go that far. Maybe I would. Californian GOP has an odd bit, though the first option on Google is actually a county GOP upload of their platform for the Stanislaus GOP, whose website is Stan GOP, which I find that funny. They have a statement that they condemn racism, xenophobia, religious intolerance, ethnic nationalism, and white supremacy, which is good. I approve of that and its explicit call out of ethno-nationalism, xenophobia, and white supremacy by name. That is impressive for conservatives. But sexism, homophobia, and transphobia are not mentioned. Now, as you'll see later, the California GOP actually does condemn sexism and homophobia in terms of discrimination. But in talking about violence, none are mentioned, despite crucially that violence against women, especially domestic violence, is one of the most frequent forms of prejudiced violence. They want equal education regardless of race, circumstances of their neighborhood, which is interesting and new so far, or socioeconomic status. I understand those being the areas called in specific, but again, it's odd what they leave out. Besides sexuality, gender identity, and sex, here they leave out disability, which is a key battleground for advancement in educational rights, specifically in regards to financing and following things such as IEPs. They also say they would like parents to be able to opt out of age-inappropriate and sexually explicit curriculum without detailing exactly what they mean by that. What do you consider age-inappropriate? Do you mean that you want an opt-out for sex ed in a generous interpretation, which is still stupid, by the way, or in a cynical interpretation? Do you have a DeSantis view that LGBT people existing is sexually explicit and inappropriate? On their equal opportunity section, they say they support laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, sex, sexual orientation, disability, or religion. Now, they don't mention gender identity here, which I believe is worthy of critique and discussion of transphobia. I do want to take a second here, though, to note the rarity of the inclusion of sexual orientation, so I do appreciate that on some level. But these traits which are mentioned here not being mentioned elsewhere, I think, doesn't speak on malice. I actually think this statement is more reflective of the Californian GOP's actual position. What I do think it showcases is a lack of specificity and perhaps a level of thought simply not engaged in on the previous parts of the platform. Now, they do say that to protect the children, marriage should be between one man and one woman, because while they may be against discriminating against gay people, they're also fine with generic homophobia restricting us from having rights. The government can freely discriminate against gay people, I guess. What I will say about the California platform is that it's so far the most detailed of the state platforms, and yet at the same time, it's not super detailed. I know the state platforms will never reach the levels of detail or length of the national platform, and they probably shouldn't. But I think if they were to go into details, they could avoid some of the discrepancies that I perceive there to be in this California platform. Either way, it's not great, but it's so far the best. Colorado. So, in keeping with the trend of each state having something new, the Colorado GOP doesn't seem to have a fully functional website. There's a section on the About page that says platform, but there's not a link there. Their Action tab leads nowhere. Their Get Involved tab is basically a blank page, though there are links at the top of every page for volunteering and donating. So my conclusion on the Colorado GOP platform is, sure would be nice to be able to read it. I guess it's the national platform in the meanwhile. Good luck with your website, guys. Connecticut. Connecticut offers a new and novel approach by not having anything on their website approaching a platform, not even the resolutions page of Arizona. Guys, why? Ballotpedia says you followed the national platform, so maybe that's why, but that's lazy, in my opinion. Just make your own. You can't be specific about the needs and beliefs of your designation and your constituents otherwise. Delaware. Well, surprise, surprise, Delaware's GOP has taken a new flavor. I didn't find anything called a platform, but I found a general brief set of "we believe" statements on an About page and a policy plan called the Rescue Delaware Plan that I believe is closer to what we'd consider a platform. The About page first. Their commitment to anti-discrimination says they want equality regardless of race, creed, sex, age, or disability. So again, no inclusion of sexual orientation or gender identity, which implies they don't mind a lack of equality based on those things. Now onto their Pseudo platform. They do actually have a statement on their education page that all instruction must reinforce the premise that characteristics such as sex, gender, sexual orientation, and religious beliefs do not define an individual's abilities or potential. Such as is great phrasing to say the list goes on from there, and it's a clear statement that, at least in schools, there should be no teaching of any sort of discrimination, and actually a forceful education of equality and shared humanities, so that's nice. And actually they reiterate that later in the document twice, with the same exact language. There's a vague discussion about a parental bill of rights that conservatives love to talk about in regards to education, letting parents have more and more say in the educational process. In some cases, that involves letting parents object to and opt out of any mention of gender and sexual orientation. I read the 2019 HB 145. They say it would be based on, but that's a very short and unspecific bill, so I can't exactly determine what the Delaware GOP means by this in any detail. Florida. So Florida's GOP, I expected, given everything about them and their actions, such as the Don't Say Gay law and their expansions of it, DeSantis' continued fight against queer people and the label of groomer towards any and all queer people disagreeing with them or existing around children. I expected that the Florida platform would be real meaty and fun to dig into. Instead, there's a mission statement, and as mission statements tend to be, it says nothing, really. Its action pages lead you to signing your name for things rather than talking policy. I glanced through the press release article posts and didn't really find a comparable document. Ballotpedia says they follow the national platform, and the Seminole County platform just leads to the national platform, so I suppose that's true. Georgia's GOP does have something new in a way that I quite appreciate, with links at the bottom of the webpage that send you to Google Drive folders with past platforms, which is really nice, honestly, for easy record keeping and investigation. Good on you. They mentioned that the traditional family is the strength of our nation, and traditional family is generally used as a statement against same-sex couples and other family structures. They endorse the national platform. So they get the fun time and have all of the fun bits that include the support for conversion therapy on the national platform. Point 8 is all about how kids in civilization need families with mommies and daddies. And if it weren't for the immediate mention of traditional family, you could think they're suggesting queer polycules are best for child rearing. But the children, as a reason to deny gay marriage and claim that our marriages go against the cornerstone of civil society. There's a vague statement about parental rights to making healthcare and educational statements. When combined with that love for the national platform, that seems almost like an endorsement of conversion therapy. When taken with their bill banning gender-affirming care, except in cases of imminent suicidality, it almost seems as if they don't actually trust parents to make those medical decisions. Curious. On their 2021 convention resolutions page, there's a long transphobic ramble against trans students, teachers, and staff, including a condescending scare quote on identify to describe trans people, saying schools that go against them should lose state funding. Hawaii. The Hawaiian GOP. Thanks for having a platform and for making the choice to have it on your website in all red font. It was unique. The section on family does go on about the importance of fathers, but it states when possible. It talks about the importance of extended family regardless of blood relation. It's interesting. The section about fatherhood does imply that lesbian families may have adverse impacts on children, despite the evidence not backing that assertion up. But they don't outright say that, and I can't even really say that they imply that. On education, after saying they're against comprehensive sex ed, which makes no sense if you actually look at the studies, they say they think sex ed should only be about reproduction. So that removes talk about STDs, consent, contraception, and other safe sex practices, but it also removes queer students from the conversation about what sex even is. Idaho. Your first Google result immediately sent me to your PDF version of your platform. Thank you. Their statement on equality once again leaves out sexual orientation and gender identity. We are strongly opposed to any social justice indoctrination in regards to education, and in that list of theories they're against, they include diversity, equity, and inclusion, queer theory. They don't want that in policies, curriculum, and or course materials. Do you mean you're against the idea that diversity is good, that people should be included in things, that gay people exist? By social justice, do you mean civil rights fights, specifically in regards to LGBT people? There's another statement about parental rights to choose what children learn. What do you mean by that? Do you mean if a parent disagrees with evolution, carbon dating, other instances of science, they can reject lessons on that or opt their child out? Does that mean parents can object freely to any mentions of sexual orientation and gender identity, including the historic LGBT civil rights efforts and SCOTUS cases? There's a statement in their healthcare section about allowing people to not participate in practices if their religious beliefs tell them not to. Apparently, they're against mandatory vaccination, which is interesting. When you mention the supreme authority of parents in medical decisions for children, do you agree with the national platform and include the decision to put their child through conversion torture as one of those medical treatments parents should be allowed to choose? They have the same talk about traditional marriage being the foundation of America and say the breakdown of the family is to blame for many of the ills of society. So we gays are ruining society. They explicitly talk about their opposition to gay marriage and actually state that Idaho is entitled to completely ignore Obergefell. They oppose any presentity or policy that attempts to confuse minors regarding their biological gender. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean opposition to all gender-affirming care? Do you consider gender-affirming care, including talk therapy, to be child abuse? If so, why don't you call out the actual child abuse of conversion therapy? Do you mean the general existence of trans people in general? Do you mean anyone who advocates against traditional gender roles, depictions in art and entertainment, drag, cross-dressing? They're explicitly homophobic and transphobic both in their rhetoric and their apparent policy goals. Illinois. The Illinois GOP isn't super unique, but they include links to both their platform and the resolutions passed in the same year, but not as a Google Drive folder, so that qualifies as a new thing, I guess. In their bit about marriage, they say children are best cared for by traditional families or one man, one woman marriages. They say all laws must consider children and families immediately after, implying that laws need to be made based around the idea that kids don't get good outcomes when raised by single parents or gay parents. The data, by the way, does not agree. There are no differences in outcome between two-parent homes of any gender and orientation. They advocate for a constitutional amendment overturning Obergefell and defining marriage as one man, one woman, so taking away my right to marry. Also, the building block of society is traditional family, and strengthening that improves life for everyone. Which gives the implication that marriage equality is the opposite of that. They say states shouldn't regulate non-public schools at all, which to me says private schools should be allowed to operate whilst receiving federal and state dollars without being subject to the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, or any educational standards. So this is nearer to the start of the platform, and I wanted to read on before commenting on it, assuming it would come up in some other way later that would be clearer. Its statement about freedoms for all people includes the non-discrimination phrase, regardless of race, color, or creed. So anti-colorism, which is cool, and I think this is another example of incompetence, more so than malice. They don't include sex, national origin, disability, or age. I'm assuming religion is under creed here. Of course, given the homophobia, it wouldn't include sexual orientation or gender identity, even if it was competently written, but it was not competently written. And I know this is me being sort of a nitpicky asshole, but these things matter when you're trying to run a governmental party that wants to convince the citizenry of your competence to run the government. Fix it, guys. It is an easy fix and something you should be conscious of going forward. Indiana. The Indiana GOP's contribution to keeping my amusement and sanity whilst reading through these is that this platform has this fun graphic and very light blue background. It's giving yearbook. It's giving, what about the Pika spacing? Oh, also, thank you for having the document the first result on Google instead of making me navigate your website. We have another statement that straight marriage is the foundation of society or whatever, though this is another one that at least acknowledges and embraces that there are other family structures, though they never mention gay couples, because why would they? There's an anti-trans girls in sports section. Indiana took an interesting choice on their anti-discrimination statement by not necessarily making one clear blanket statement, instead having individual sections contained within other areas. There are sections on women, the elderly, disabled folks, and so on. Though of course, there's no such commitment anywhere to supporting LGBT Hoosiers. Iowa has a very interesting thing wherein it seems like their platform page is the one page of their website that's slightly broken with the header and footer. As such, it looks very mid-2000s internet. They want justices who respect tradition, family values, which, guys, I want to call it the homophobia. And look, typos happen, they do, but this is a professional political document from 2018. I have 1,000 typos everywhere, but I'm also not a political party. Anyway, they talk about straight marriage being the foundation to a stable, enduring, and healthy civilization, which is why they then say that they want any laws letting us queers get married to be repealed. So obviously the implication is that gay marriage is destabilizing, injurious, civilization-ending apocrypha, which is just homophobic nonsense. They want religious people to be able to discriminate, and when you first read that bullet point, you might think, surely that's limited to performing marriages. But then they specifically say that sexual orientation shouldn't be included in any non-discrimination laws at any level of the government because they want to discriminate against us, because they are bigots. Incompetent bigots. They also mention prohibiting any organizations from promoting promiscuous behavior on school grounds. But what do they mean by that? They're not specific. What would they call promiscuous? What would they call sexual? Is comprehensive sex ed encouraging of promiscuity? How about guest speakers coming to talk about consent or sexual assault? Gay-straight alliances. Is this an instance of the Florida GOP who considers the mere existence and discussion of queer people to be inherently sexual and inappropriate? They suggest that courts have no actual power, effectively saying SCOTUS is merely an advisory branch of government, and thereby making meaningless every court case ever, including all of the LGBT rights ones. Their anti-discrimination statement includes only race, gender, and disability, so I suppose age, religion, and gender identity are all up for free grabs. We already know they think sexual orientation is something they must be allowed to discriminate against. Kansas. The Kansas GOP has a fun, weird border frame around the margins of each page, which is interesting and new, but I'm more interested in that the file name for the platform starts with Microsoft Word. I laughed. They have their transphobia against trans girls in sports. I was confused by the lack of homophobia until I got to the preserving traditional families section. Guess where Kansas starts to get entirely fucked. They make a natural law argument against gay marriage, say only straight marriages should get the legal benefits of marriage, and that, hey, gay marriage will probably doom the country. They make the unscientific claim that straight marriages lead to the best outcomes for children. The data, again, does not support this. They use that lie to advocate for a constitutional amendment defining marriage as one man and one woman. In the same section where they go against gay people over and over, they say, parents must be free to train and discipline their children in love and direct their education and healthcare according to their beliefs and values without government intrusion. Which to me sounds like an endorsement of a Don't Say Gay bill and a declaration, given that it is in a section focused on attacking queer families, that the Kansas GOP is opposed to any bans on conversion therapy. Parents have a right to torture their kids if they want. Disgusting. Kentucky. Kentucky's GOP has a odd distinction in that my web browser said not secure while on their website. That is unique, I'll give you that. Anyway, Kentucky doesn't have a specific platform, sending people to go read the national platform, so you can assume that entire section applies here. Louisiana. Well, with the Louisiana GOP, I think we hit our first not unique, which I suppose is unique. Anywho, they also just lead you to the national platform. Maine. I don't know, there's nothing special about Maine. They say schools shouldn't promote hormones or surgery in regards to trans-affirming healthcare, though I have to wonder what exactly they consider promoting, especially given that it says teaching about trans people is something they consider child sexual abuse. They specifically say that child sex abuse is now the teaching or promotion of biological genders other than those of male and female Homo sapiens. Adding on the Homo sapiens bit makes it seem like teaching about male and female flies, for instance, would be child sex abuse. Sure hope that selective breeding and Darwin aren't important parts of biology classes. Says schools cannot withhold information regarding identity changes or group activities to guardians. In a section that has been discussing trans people, that to me is a clear statement that the Maine GOP thinks schools have a right, no, a duty, to out students to their parents, to tell them that they are trans or gay or questioning, or even simply involved in a gay-straight alliance regardless of their personal identity. When no. Teachers don't have the right to out kids. The right to come out only resides within the individual. I will reiterate that over and over. Parents do not have the right to know that about their child, and often, parents, it has nothing to do with you if your child doesn't come out to you. The process of coming out looks different for every person, and dozens of things can go into it. Maybe they're scared because a political party is telling them that adults simply affirming them and nothing else are abusing them. Maybe you've made a throwaway comment that stuck with them. Maybe it doesn't matter. That is their information to share as they please, not the school's, not yours, theirs. It then has don't say gay-esque language, where it doesn't define what sexually based material it prohibits from schools, and third parties are prohibited from sharing and may invite. They go on to say lawsuits from parents for including. You know, Shakespeare's shows are filled to the brim with dick jokes. Is it now sexual abuse to teach Shakespeare? To answer a student when they ask what Shakespeare means? Is kissing or holding hands sexually based material? Well, then there goes the majority of literature. Is it just LGBT people existing? Probably. Then that's dehumanizing bigotry. There's yet another no trans girls in sports bit, and here we go. A statement that says schools cannot include material that encourages students to choose their own gender, sexual orientation, or personal pronouns. There we go. A statement that being trans or gay is a choice. A statement that students should not know about LGBT people. A statement that teachers and material should have no ability to affirm students in their identity. It's England's Section 28. Then they say the government should only recognize straight marriage, the foundation and strength of a stable society, which obviously means gay marriage destabilizes society. A statement that parents are the best to make medical, disciplinary, and educational decisions, which unfortunately I can only assume based off the national platform, the homophobia and transphobia present elsewhere in this platform, and the entire premise of this section, means that parents should be allowed to send their child to and engage themselves in attempted conversion torture of the queer children. There's an implied support for adoption services discriminating against LGBT people. Maryland GOP, another just go to the national platform place, so that entire section applies here. Massachusetts had some vague "we believe" statements. Ballotpedia gives an overview of what it says is the 2014 platform, but the link was dead, and I don't want to assume a platform nearly a decade old still applies. As such, I'm going to assume that the National Party platform speaks here, but I truly do not know. Michigan's GOP has a short About Me section that isn't very detailed. Ballotpedia says it follows the national platform, so everything I said in that section applies here as well. Minnesota GOP, thank you for having an actual platform to read through. There's a statement that businesses and individuals should be able to discriminate against people in regards to marriage, which seems to me, since it's unspecific, to include hotels, secular venue owners, cab and rideshare companies, newspaper announcements, government county clerks who issue marriage licenses, and so on. You have to be specific, or I will take the most uncharitable vague reading of the law. They want religious institutions, including schools and hospitals, to be allowed to discriminate in hiring practices, presumably against LGBT people. They want healthcare professionals to be able to use religion as an excuse not to perform practices or give medication for things that they don't agree with, presumably so religious queerphobes can discriminate in healthcare against LGBT people, including the dispensing and filling of prescriptions, handling of contraceptives, use of PrEP, potential HIV/AIDS medication, education to patients about LGBT people in healthcare, and so on. There's a transphobic mention about bathrooms. Hey, in this platform, they are recognizing a right to voluntary reparative therapy. Reparative therapy is the fun fucking label people use, so they don't have to say conversion therapy. Both of which, by the way, are misnomers for torture. So let me ask you a question, Minnesota. A minor is subjected to conversion therapy. Their parent consented to it. Does that count as voluntary consent? In other words, a parent subjecting, forcing, their child to go through mental, spiritual, and emotional abuse for a practice which has no medical evidence in its support. If someone is convinced to go through conversion torture because of the spiritual abuse of those around them at the advice of employers or the insistence of public officials, is that voluntary? No, it's fucking not. The Minnesota GOP is openly advocating for the torture of LGBT people under the guise of medical choice and the false belief that LGBT people are choosing to be LGBT. In their education statements, they say they support the appeal of the Minnesota anti-bullying law, so I went and read that law to see what must be so awful about it. I went to stopbullying.gov actually to see what the law is. There are several statutes, and this platform doesn't specify which one it wants repealed, so we could assume that they mention each statute, but I'm going to save us time and assume they mean 121A.031, School Student Bullying Policy. Subdivision 2, Definitions, Section G.
Intimidating, threatening, abusive, or harming conduct may involve, but is not limited to, conduct directed at any student or students, including those based on a person's actual or perceived race, ethnicity, color, creed, religion, national origin, immigration status, sex, marital status, familiar status, socioeconomic status, physical appearance, sexual orientation, including gender identity and expression, so on and so on.
Is that what they take issue with? That's my guess. The defining of bullying as including harassment against the aforementioned attributes. I don't know because they're not specific in the platform. So what is it that you take issue with? How would you replace it? Because you say you want to put power back in local communities, how will you make sure that minority students are prevented from facing targeted harassment in a community filled with people who agree with the prejudices that lead to said harassment, and therefore do not want to call their harassment bullying? They want to ignore actual science and put in the idea that creationism is a valid intellectual idea instead of religious nonsense, which therefore implies they don't actually care about actual data. That's why they also oppose comprehensive sexual education. Given their latter discussion on marriage, we can then say they think that LGBT students should be excluded from their abstinence-only education because they only want it for marriage. Teachers should not discuss or teach about alternative sexual lifestyles, by which they mean non-straight people should not be mentioned or discussed, queer civil rights should not be mentioned or discussed, and in which they imply a normal and an abnormal, a functional and non-functional status to orientation, which is clear discriminatory intent and bigotry. Given what they say later about marriage, when they say teachers should teach that extramarital sex is wrong, there's a clear indication that they think teachers should be teaching that sex between gay people is morally wrong. They want state and national amendments to only allow straight marriage, and say that any domestic partnership should not receive any of the governmental benefits marriage gives to couples. So this disgusting article was written and approved not in 2014 or 2016 or 2020, in 2022. Mississippi. Mississippi's GOP has a platform page with collapsible entries, so thank you for that, I guess, for anyone who wants to quickly look at specific sections and not Control F. On an unrelated note, there's a paragraph break in your taxes section that doesn't need to be there, and another one in your public safety section. It just looks wrong, you guys. Well, guess what the very last thing they say on their last entry, values, is? The thought that the Mississippi GOP wants to leave you on is that they think marriages should only be for straight people. They end on a statement that they might like to do away with my right to be married. Missouri. Missouri's GOP specifically says it's a 2023 platform, a colorblind thing, but the header combination of color for the graphic with the font color for the top text makes it a little bit unreadable. Their platform is broken up into separate web pages, which is very annoying. Make it a single document, please. They have a section going against trans kids being able to use the bathroom. They have a statement against marriage equality. There's support for religious people to be able to discriminate whilst using their religion as an excuse. They make some vague statement about parental rights in education and healthcare, and based on the trend, my go-to assumption is that this includes conversion torture, but does not include affirming care for trans kids. Montana GOP's claim to fame seems to be a slightly smaller font choice, so I had to zoom in a little bit. They oppose any educational activity that demonizes or disparages any individual group based on race, ethnicity, sex, religion, or political affiliation. Now, under Bostock, that means sexual orientation and gender, but the GOP tends to not like that, so I'm assuming the lack of inclusion here means they are fine with educational activities that demonize LGBT people. They mentioned restricting marriage to only straight marriage, specifically actually straight cis marriage, as a thing the people of Montana approved, which lets them say, yeah, no marriage equality, whilst blaming their constituents for that position instead of taking responsibility for their own political viewpoint. There's an implication that people should be allowed to use religion to discriminate in personal, public, and business matters. Nebraska. The Nebraska GOP's platform just jumps straight into the planks and also labels each plank as a plank, which is accurate, but somehow odd. There's no title or preamble on the document, by the way, which is also odd. We object to the use of the United States military to further social agendas that conflict with good order, morale, and discipline. Now, that doesn't really say anything specific, but if you remember back to Ted Cruz and Mike Pence, that was the sort of argument used to oppose the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and was used to defend the Trump trans military ban. They want schools to use chromosomes to define male and female as a transphobic dig before going after trans kids in sports and using the bathroom. They're ignoring, again, chromosomal variance amongst cis people and the existence of intersex people. They want Obergefell overturned and say that marriage should be straight only. They want adoption agencies to be able to discriminate against LGBT people. They want judges appointed who believe in straight marriage only. Nevada's GOP platform. Click here to read the platform after having a specific page about your platform. Is it possible just to have it on the page? Is that hard? Anyway, they're unique in that they have their lines clearly numbered on each page and have everything but the title left justified, including section headings. In their statement against discrimination, they actually include both gender and sexual orientation. Whether gender identity is included is anyone's guess. There's an implication that religious people should be allowed to discriminate. They say they don't want school time in any way to include radical sex education, gender identity issues, amongst other things. I don't know what they mean by the first one, but it is odd. They follow that with a screed against trans students in sports or using the bathroom. They're against hormonal and surgical treatments for any minor, not just trans ones, which seems like it might have a negative impact on some potential necessary medical procedures based on some need to protect minor fertility, which I know what they mean by that, but it's just such a gross thing to write out and say. New Hampshire. They have an odd way of organizing in that their subsection headings are in larger font than their section headings. There's a statement about wanting only straight marriage while also saying to recognize it as a sacred thing, putting government support behind religion. So that's fun. That's about all they had though. New Jersey. New Jersey sends us to the national platform, so all of that applies here as well. New Mexico. New Mexico's GOP has an about page with sections you think are going to links, but they're actually cards that flip around so you can read brief statements, which is, it's a choice. I guess it's fun. But I just want to access the information and the specifics. There aren't really specifics here. They do say that they want a constitutional amendment defining marriage as one man, one woman. They don't have much info in general though, which sucks. New York. The New York GOP's website has an about page which starts with a long spiel about their current chairman, because I guess learning about this egoist is more important than informing the people about your views and policy prescriptions. Nothing on the website approaches a platform. Ballotpedia says to go to the national platform, so all of that here, again, I assume. North Carolina. North Carolina's GOP, another one whose document starts with Microsoft Word as the title. Come on, guys, just change the file name after you save the document to your computer. Anyway, your font size is a little bit too small for your body text. In the preamble, they say they're against bigotry, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, ethnic prejudice, and religious intolerance. Okay, right, well, what do you include under bigotry? Ageism, ableism. You named a few specific things, but declined to say homophobia or transphobia. Are those included under bigotry? They say straight marriage is the foundation of a civil society, so therefore the implication is gay marriage erodes civility. Anyway, they want Obergefell overturned and the ability to define marriage in a discriminatory way. They want all institutions to be able to use religion to deny healthcare and discriminate against people, assumedly against LGBT people. Unrelated, but Article 5, you start numbering your points at number 9, not accidentally starting with the wrong number, but literally not numbering the lines until you get to 9, which is labeled, and it just looks incompetent. There's also an issue with formatting on point 10 that's very obvious to the eye, and you should have caught it. Anyway, in a FATA-esque statement, they want the state to not be allowed to discriminate against someone for their religious moral convictions. Now, is that a statement against general discrimination based on religion, such as forcing a Jewish person to work on the Sabbath? Or is that a statement that the government should not be able to take action against individuals and organizations when they use religion as their excuse to violate non-discrimination laws? Public schools should not be permitted to teach children about homosexual behavior and gender identity. What do you mean? Can they have books which include LGBT people in their school libraries? Can they learn about our fights for civil rights? Can they discuss current events in high school history courses and the instances where LGBT people and our status as LGBT is pertinent to the event? Can schools discuss what being gay or trans even is? What is homosexual behavior? Everything I do, as I am a homosexual, is technically homosexual behavior. What happens if a teacher plays a news story and the news story mentions sexuality? Stop hiding behind vague language and say what you mean. Oh, they want abstinence only outside of marriage, which they already stated they only want to be straight, so therefore leaving their queer students to fend for themselves, or to be told that any expression of their sexuality is and always will be wrong, which, you might have guessed it, is emotionally scarring and I would say might qualify as abuse. They say trans girls shouldn't be in sports. And they have sudden center justification at the very end of the document. Why? North Dakota. North Dakota's GOP has their platform as a list of drop-down entries, and I don't know, maybe I appreciate that. I've been reading so many of these fucking platforms, I don't really care anymore. Every entry is short and not very informative. They say policy should encourage straight marriage without outright calling for gay marriage to be banned, but that's kind of the implication. Oh, also, they say they don't believe being trans is a thing. Ohio. Ohio looks like it's another national platform thing, so copy-paste here. Oklahoma. Okay, GOP, now let's look at your platform. They want straight marriage, a vague statement about parents in healthcare, which based on previous platforms and the national one, is about the right to refuse vaccines and to force their kids into conversion torture. Oh hey, any benefits married people get, taxpayers get to opt out of if they're homophobic and the couple is queer. They want religious people to be able to discriminate. There's a statement of transphobia and biology. They want abstinence-only education, which, given their thoughts on marriage, means queer students are shut out and uneducated. They want conversion torture for trans kids and oppose affirming therapy. They want gender-affirming care to be seen as child abuse and malpractice. They do not want government oversight on religious counseling, which to me is a clear statement that religious-based conversion torture for anyone is a religious right. They don't want anti-discrimination laws for anyone's sexual preference or lifestyle choices, clearly implying that sexual orientation is a choice, which it is not, and morally wrong, which it is not. Why would they say this? Because they want to discriminate against LGBT people. They want schools to teach that families are only straight families, so I guess we're teaching homophobia and transphobia in schools now and telling kids to bully each other. That's great. They want public schools to allow the teaching of the Judeo-Christian worldview, which one must assume is their version of religion and is an expressly homophobic and transphobic version of Christianity. They want creationism to be taught alongside evolution with equal time as if it's a legitimate scientific thing instead of religious bullshit with no evidence. That's important because they then go on to say the Bible should be able to be taught as a history text. That matters because then it's a question of, are teachers now preachers of some sort? Are they going to state that Sodom was destroyed because of homosexuality, even though that's not what happens in the story, and have students believe that that's a historical event, even though there's no evidence for that? Because then we have public schools teaching Christianity and presumably religious homophobia both as fact. They want trans kids not to be able to participate in sports or use the bathroom, and they use chromosome language again, completely ignoring intersex people and chromosomal variants amongst cis people. We oppose the portrayal of homosexual or promiscuous behavior in a positive light in public schools. Because of course. Oh, and in case anyone had any doubts, they say, we oppose any non-chromosomal gender re-education and the teaching of LGBTQ lifestyle, history, and demonstration in public schools. So LGBT people don't exist for them. We can't be mentioned. Our fight for rights cannot be mentioned. Our protests, our history, anything. We must be demons who have nothing. They specifically want colleges to let everyone misgender and dead name people, pretty much saying, let them harass trans people all they want. They want all non-discrimination ordinances for LGBT people to be repealed and then banned. They want a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage. They want any private association to be able to discriminate against anyone for whatever reason. They want the re-implementation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So, fuck you, Oklahoma. You are not okay, GOP. Oregon's GOP has a novel way of numbering things in each section. I don't know, I'm turned off by the whimsy I've been doing by reading fucking Oklahoma's entire goddamn thing. They want the government to get permission before discussing anything about sex or gender. Now, does that mean absolutely everything about gender? The Women's Rights Campaign, Mr. versus Mrs. Does sex here only mean coitus, or does it mean sexual orientation as well? They don't really want trans kids in bathroom, but to their credit, they want everyone to be able to have a bathroom and schools to do their absolute best to accommodate, so maybe letting certain students use staff facilities or something like that. Oh, and trans girls can't be in sports, of course. They want only straight marriage. They say there's no such thing as trans people, and also assert a biological essentialism in how sex should be expressed in feminine and masculine ways. So congrats on being both transphobic and very sexist at the same time. It's almost like transphobia and sexism are interlocked prejudices. They call gender-affirming care sexual exploitation. There's an implication about letting healthcare providers use religion or morals as an excuse to discriminate, potentially. Reading through the healthcare section, I get the idea that they support conversion torture, especially when done by religious services and forced upon children by their parents, but there's nothing that outright says it, and it doesn't imply as much as the other platforms have. They want religious people to be able to discriminate with impunity. Pennsylvania's GOP has vague statements on its About page, and Ballotpedia says it goes by the National Platform, so that's probably why I didn't find many details or documents, so again, copy, paste. Rhode Island's GOP has an issue section which is similar to a platform, I guess. The only problem is it doesn't really talk about a lot of issues. In fact, it barely talks about anything relevant, so I found nothing I could use. Ballotpedia linked to a 2016 platform, but when I clicked the link, it was a JPEG of nothing, so I don't want to go with what that says. I'm gonna guess the national platform applies here in the areas that weren't mentioned on their website. South Carolinian GOP, why did you choose a flyer type of layout for your platform? Their idea of discrimination, worth mentioning, only applies to race and gender. They want only straight marriage, they want that strictly taught by schools, and they want the state itself to use that when doing adoption and foster care services. It's a direct call to discriminate against LGBT people. Religious adoption agencies get to discriminate, obviously, because the government gets to discriminate. They want religious people to get to discriminate however they want, as long as it's done in the name of religion. They want abstinence-only education, and only abstinence-only education, laughably after talking about teen pregnancy rates as if abstinence has any evidence showcasing its viability and good outcomes. But that education is also colored by the fact that they don't believe in gay marriage, so again, queer children are shut out of education. South Dakotan GOP, here we go. They want to make their schools free from inappropriate sexual and/or cultural information. What does that mean? Is that a statement about sexual orientation and gender identity? Is it a statement about literally anything, since it said cultural and everything is culture? They say they don't want trans kids to have proper accommodations or to be in sports or bathrooms. They also do the statement about chromosomes, as if there weren't intersex people and chromosomal variation amongst cis people. They want marriage to be between one cis man and one cis woman. Then they say that they affirm that's the best arrangement for raising a child, as if that's a fact supported by data that they're just supporting. The data doesn't support that point. They're lying. All of this has been done by so many of the states before. Tennessee's GOP is a look at the national platform thing, so that's what there is here. Texas. All right, here we go. Yeehaw. There's a statement about natural law. Desire for only straight marriage. They call transition-related medical procedures things designed to fake transition. They want to add penalties for companies who boycott Texas for any potential transphobia. They want absolutely no sex education or mention of sexual orientation in public schools, and they want to prevent anyone from sharing information or offering materials that might do either of those things. They want a more comprehensive version of Florida's Don't Say Gay law, so they can prohibit instruction in sexual orientation and gender identity in public schools. which, if you recall, instruction in that law really means discussion. So no queer people ever mentioned, our fights for rights never mentioned, current events involving us never able to be discussed, families shunned and unable to be mentioned, no efforts to curtail bullying or affirm children, no books or any other art form that contains any depictions of LGBT people, no discussion of gender play in historic theater, which means robbing Shakespeare of his context if he's even allowed to be taught at all. They want anyone who breaks that law to have their education certification removed and then to prosecute them. You want Orwell? That's Orwell. They call drag queen story hours some sort of adult sex entertainment when that is an incorrect categorization of the event. Story hours involve appropriate dress and the reading of children's books. That can only be sexual if you imagine any dressing outside of assumed gender expectations to be sexual, in which case, can a man ever wear a dress? Can a woman wear pants? Or are both of those always instances of adult sexual entertainment? They don't want trans kids in sports. They want schools to teach biological essentialism. We oppose transgender normalizing curriculum and pronoun use. Since they want a Florida law, and that law uses educational language to mean discussion, it seems here that they want to completely abolish the idea of affirming a trans student. Preferred names and pronouns can't be used. Students being harassed cannot be told that it's okay to be who they are. Harassers can't be told that harassing is wrong for the reason that they're doing it. Trans people must be seen as incorrect. We oppose using public funds for homosexuality, transgender, or diversity, equity, inclusion centers on college campuses. Homosexuality is an abnormal lifestyle choice. It's not a choice, it's not a lifestyle, and it's not abnormal. The Texas GOP is simply a collection of bigots, extremists. They oppose all anti-discrimination laws for LGBT people. They oppose any action against anyone who discriminates against LGBT people. They oppose all efforts to validate transgender identity. It seems as if that statement, that belief in validity, is what makes a trans person really trans, an idea that it might as well be a choice. They oppose gender-affirming care for anyone 21 or younger. That's right, not only for minors, it's for adults 18 to 21. They specifically say there will be no bans on people who want to do conversion torture on LGBT people. They attempt to give it credence by calling it reintegrative therapy. So let's do a side tangent. Reintegrative therapy is a trademark because of course the GOP is shilling in the platform for a fucking company. It tries to distance itself by saying it's not conversion therapy. It doesn't aim to change sexual orientation. It just happens when you resolve trauma. Because obviously trauma is the cause of being gay. That's an assessment that has no actual evidence for it, by the way, and there's no evidence to support the idea that any sort of therapy can change sexual orientation. Not only do they do that, but they also try to do damage control for conversion therapists, defending them from charges of harm and use of aversion techniques. They say of evidence about conversion therapy's negative side effects that there are some reports vary. They don't. There's no evidence that conversion therapy works. There's mounds of evidence that it's harmful. There are countless stories of harm inflicted onto individuals. There are numerous individuals who chose not to stick around on this earth because of the damage inflicted on them by conversion therapy. To play, oh, who knows? It was absolute horse shit. They want to be very clear that they're not conversion therapy. They're just advocating and talking about our ability to suddenly change someone's sexuality, a thing that we're actually doing. They're surely not conversion therapy. Reintegrative therapy cites a long-term study that shows their practice works. The claim is examined in an analysis of the group by Gregory Coles at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. Now, that center is a Side B Christian organization, so it's also an inherently homophobic group that's whole existence is meant to harm queer people. Despite that, Cole's examination of the study shows that 1, it's published not in a reputable journal, and 2, it does not seem to have data that supports its conclusion. Not that the data is even gathered in a particularly useful way. But let's keep going. Reintegrative was founded by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. Who is that? Well, his father, Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, I don't give a shit, did reparative therapy, also known as conversion therapy, also known as debunked nonsense that does not work. He also founded the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, known as NARTH, a conversion therapy advocacy group. A packet of their material is actually sort of the event that led to the Netflix documentary Pray Away. According to Mother Jones, they rebranded as the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, advocating for continued conversion therapy for those with unwanted homosexual attractions. According to the director of Pray Away, at least when she did the interview, the person who runs that new group is, or was, Dr. Jr. there. Dr. Jr. wrote an article for the Daily Signal, decrying Amazon banning his daddy's books. He defends his father's legacy and pretends that reparative therapy works. The way he discusses his father's efforts are quite similar to how he describes reintegrative therapy. He claims LGBT ideology is destroying proper science. Despite talks about how it was secular, Dr. Jr. does away with that here by admitting it was due to his father's religious beliefs and getting people to try to be straight because that's what they think the Bible tells them to be. Here's the thing. The American Psychological Association calls bullshit on that. It quotes a former president of the APA as saying, "So-called reparative therapies are aimed at fixing something that is not a mental illness, and they have the potential to harm the client." The APA also disagrees with Dr. Jr.'s assertion that reparative therapy is something else other than conversion therapy, and it disagrees that there's any indication that self-reported attraction models are accurate studies rather than people who may have wanted or been told to want to change, who have decided to not acknowledge their own attraction. The APA advocates for conversion therapy bans. Reparative therapy is included within that because it is conversion therapy, and it should be banned. So then, we can imagine that Dr. Jr. has an invested interest in defending and supporting his father's homophobic torture legacy. By heading his torture group and rebranding his torture methods, Dr. Jr. is following his father's footsteps and playbooks. It is quite beyond easy to say that reintegrative therapy is more pseudo-scientific bullshit to defend inflicting harm on patients under the guise of pretending it is therapy instead of what it actually is: mental, spiritual, and emotional abuse. That's the specific by-name practice the GOP of Texas endorses. They want healthcare professionals to have the ability to discriminate. They want businesses to be legally allowed to be as transphobic as they want. They want people to be able to discriminate and to be cruel based on someone's status as trans and to not be able to be held liable for that, which seems to be in direct opposition to Bostock. They call being trans a mental health condition as if that is a fact when it's not. The APA does not agree. No major medical organization agrees. They call gender-affirming surgery mutilation. They want the government to be unable to recognize gender identity on any documents. They want detransitioners to be able to sue those from whom they access gender-affirming care for malpractice. They again state their opposition to gay marriage. They state opposition to non-discrimination laws, their desire to be able to not recognize gay marriages no matter where they were performed. They want to outlaw any gender affirmation, including allowance of social transition and general therapy. So discredited conversion torture is allowed, but medical best practice for trans kids is outlawed because Texas does not care about children. They care about control and inflicting harm on LGBT people. They want to deny same-sex partners marriage benefits. They explicitly call for Obergefell to be overturned. They say, in the state of Texas, all children to be adopted only by married or single heterosexuals. So not only must you disclose your sexuality to the state if you're a single person, you get to be discriminated against by the government on the basis of you or your partner's sex. They pretend as if that's in the best interest of the child, but again, the evidence does not support that. Though clearly the Texas GOP doesn't care about evidence. They actively ignore it and lie about it. So that's the worst platform. I had to go through this entire nonsense of reading every state platform so as not to judge each state party by this platform. This is filled with disgusting rhetoric, lies, misrepresentations, calls for discrimination, and an explicit endorsement of torture against LGBT people. That's Texas. Utah and GOP. The first Google result was the 2009 platform, which was odd. I don't know, thanks for making me take a second to think after the absolute blast of anger that was Texas. Or so I thought, until according to your website, it looks like the 2009 platform is still your platform? In which case, it's been over a decade. Updated. The lives of your constituents and the reality of the world have changed in ways which you need to rise to the occasion and explain how you will meet. I know you and I disagree on what those solutions will be, but 2023 is not 2009 in a lot of ways. For the benefit of the people you serve, you owe it to them to be up to date. Please, just show basic competency. So, the fucking 2009 platform. They mentioned the traditional family as the basic building block of society. On their equal rights section, they say, no individual is entitled to rights that exceed or supersede the God-given individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution. And just what the fuck does that mean? I can only assume it's a backlash to the fight for LGBT rights, but who knows, because it's a sentence that is literally meaningless. I wanted to read more, but there is nothing, because apparently we are in the year 2009. Vermont GOP. Oh hey, look, theirs is from 2022. Thank you. A relevant and recent platform addressing the concerns of the day. Who knew you could do that? They have a statement on discrimination where they include sexual orientation as a class to be protected against discrimination, though they do not include gender identity. Maybe they meant to by listing gender, and that's it. There's no mention about being anti-gay marriage, nothing about how they hate trans people. I guess the Vermont GOP is the future of the party, if they actually want to respect their fellow human beings. Virginia. Supposedly the brief creed on their Our Party page is their platform. Short statements without policy objectives or specific beliefs about the issues of our days. So that's frustrating. I can't make any conclusions because it barely says anything. I want details. I'm going to assume, since there isn't anything called a platform, that actually they adopt the national platform, because this page on the website is pathetic if it's meant to be a platform. Washingtonian GOP, or however the fuck you conjugate your state. Your header and loader has some unique choices that I'm going to say don't make sense to me because I'm colorblind, and not because it's an awful design. They want religious exemption to non-discrimination policies for individuals and businesses. They say there's no such thing as trans people. They say marriage should be between one man and one woman because they can have babies, which is apparently the only reason for marriage, and definitely why we make couples have children and why we watch them fuck and we make them take fertility tests and we dissolve marriages if one person loses fertility. They support biological essentialism, so enforce gender stereotypes, pretending as if that is what we are destined for based off our gametes. They want trans women and trans girls out of sports. They want schools to not teach anything about LGBT people, and also use the word transsexual, definitely a thing that the majority of trans people call themselves now. No offense if you do call yourself a transsexual, it's totally fine. They want absolute rights to make medical decisions in families, so I guess anti-vaccine and potentially pro-conversion torture, if they were specific. West Virginia's GOP, I don't know. They're the first one that has an era of applicability, so this is clearly stated to be from 2020 to 2024. Whatever. They don't believe in gay marriage. They don't want trans people to be able to use bathrooms. They want judges who will go against gay marriage. They want anyone to be able to use religion to discriminate against gay people in regards to marriage. They don't like non-discrimination laws in general. They want a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the type of thing that says, hey, you're religious, do whatever the fuck you want. Who cares if you're discriminating? Wisconsin! I am so close to being done with this awful goddamn fucking list. Wisconsin's GOP. There's a sort of thought that straight families are superior and a preemptive, just because we don't like gay marriage doesn't mean we hate gay people. But they don't outright say any of that, it's just implied. There's a the law shouldn't discriminate in areas of justice sort of statement that includes sexual orientation, so that's good. Appreciate it. It's a relatively short platform that doesn't necessarily have a lot of policy goals, but more statements that might be expanded into policy goals if they chose to be specific. But at least it's not as terribly vague as some other states, I guess. Wyoming, the last one. Fucking finally. Your unique quality is telling us how long it takes to read the document. Thanks? There's an implication that religious people should be allowed to use religion to discriminate against LGBT people, anti-trans religious statement, they're anti-gay marriage, there's that lie that straight parents are better at raising children when that is not what the data says. And those are the platforms. Now, that's all the GOP state platforms, so let's do some data analysis. GOP state parties against marriage equality, either outright wanting marriage restriction or saying that straight marriage is the biggest good of society and thereby implying gay marriage is harmful and bad. 45, that's 90%. Ones that leave out sexual orientation on their statements for non-discrimination or specifically call for it to not be included in non-discrimination ordinances, though this doesn't count the platforms that had no mention of any anti-discrimination statement, and who knows what they think on the matter. 30, 60%. Ones that leave out gender identity on statements about non-discrimination or advocate for such discrimination, though again, this doesn't include those platforms that don't make blatant statements about non-discrimination, though based on the other information, if they did, this number would be quite a bit higher, 35, 70%. The ones that endorse, defend, or otherwise imply a commitment against bans on conversion therapy, aka torture inflicted on LGBT people, 24. Now that number could go down by maybe about 5 depending upon what exactly they mean in certain vague wordings, but lots of the platforms weren't very specific at all, so who knows? It could also go up if they release updated, detailed platforms, so at least 48%. Ones that call for allowance for discrimination and adoption specifically, 22. 44%. Those are only the platforms that mention adoption, however, and does not take into account general calls for discrimination to be allowed against LGBT people carte blanche for religious people, in which case this number would likely be higher. A reminder that Texas specifically didn't call for an allowance for discrimination, but state-mandated discrimination. However, I do want to point out the language that kids are best served by straight couples, which is a lie, I remind you, is placed there not only as a defense of straight marriage in most of these platforms, but must be extrapolated as to be the basis of a state interest in discriminating in adoption, foster care, and general child care. In that case, the number would be 45, so that is anywhere between 44 to 90%. Ones that call for religious people to be allowed to discriminate against LGBT people, 29. 58%. I had more statistics I wanted to tabulate, but as I was going through, I think it's unfair to present more statistics this way because the years between now and the last version of the adopted platform does not take into account the fervor for anti-LGBT rhetoric that has stricken conservatives. But I felt it was important to go through state by state to make it clear that this is not the fault of a single national committee. This is a party belief in nearly all places across the goddamn country. Don't you just love it? Current GOP senators. Okay, so we've established the positions of the party platform, state and national, but candidates don't always fall perfectly in line with platforms. So let's do a brief overview of every single current GOP senator. John Thune, anti-LGBT hate group FRC 2022 endorsement. His FRC scorecard in the 117th Congress was 88. He was a no on the Respect for Marriage Act. He was a no on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. His human rights campaign scores the last 3 Congresses were 5-0-0. He voted no on a 2015 Al Franken amendment that would ban discrimination based on sexual orientation in public schools. John Barrasso, FRC 2018 endorsement. His FRC scorecard was 93. The Family Research Council is an anti-LGBT hate group. He was chairman of the committee in charge of the 2016 platform, so against marriage equality, pro-discrimination, pro-conversion torture, etc., etc. He was a no on the Respect for Marriage Act. His HRC scores were 5-0-0. He voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Joni Ernst, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 71, Human Rights Campaign scores 19-0-0, signed onto a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment, issued a statement against Obergefell and marriage equality. Shelley Moore Capito, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 63, HRC scores 19-0-0, voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Steve Daines, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100, no on the Respect for Marriage Act, HRC scores 5-0-0, signed onto a brief on Obergefell urging SCOTUS not to recognize gay marriage, signed onto a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. issued a statement against Obergefell and marriage equality. He wants warnings on TV shows that have LGBT people in them so parents can protect their poor little babies from knowing we exist. And deciding for some reason that the existence of LGBT people is inherently hypersexual. Marsha Blackburn, FRC 2018 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. Her HRC score 0, 0, and 0. As part of the 2012 GOP National Committee leadership, filed a brief in Obergefell arguing for bans on gay marriage because something the downfall of civil society. Signed on to a brief arguing on the side of discrimination in Bostock. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. John Boozman, FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 94. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. No for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC scores 5, 0, and 0. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Mike Braun, FRC 2018 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. HRC score is 5, 0. Signed on to a brief arguing on the side of discrimination in Bostock. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. He wants warnings on TV shows with LGBT people so parents can protect their poor little babies from knowing we exist, and deciding for some reason that the existence of LGBT people is inherently hypersexual. Newly elected Katie Britt. There's not much on her, but voiced support for a Don't Say Gay bill in Alabama. Ted Budd, FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard when he was a representative 100. He was a no on the Respect for Marriage Act. His Human Rights Campaign scores are 0, 0, and 0. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Bill Cassidy, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 88. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. His HRC scores are 12, 0, and 0. He voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Susan Collins, one of the more decent ones. FRC scorecard 35. HRC scores 54, 51, 33. John Cornyn, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 82. No on Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC scores 11, 0, and 0. Signed on to a brief arguing on the side of discrimination in Bostock. Voted against Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Made statements against Obergefell and marriage equality. Tom Cotton, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 94. No on Respect for Marriage Act. HRC score is 0, 0, and 0. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Voted against Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Kevin Kramer, FRC 2018 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. HRC scores 5, 0, and 0. Signed on to a brief arguing on the side of discrimination in Bostock. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Made comments against gay marriage while also saying he doesn't give a shit about it really, so maybe don't bother too much with it or whatever. He wants warnings on TV shows with LGBT people so parents can protect their poor little babies from knowing we exist, and declaring for some reason his belief that the existence of LGBT people is inherently hypersexual. Mike Crapo, he's full of crap, so who cares? FRC scorecard 100, no on the Respect for Marriage Act, no on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC scores 5, 0, and 0. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Made a statement against Obergefell and said that he wants for people to be able to define marriage in ways that demean and deny rights to others. Deb Fisher, FRC 2018 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act, no on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC scores 5, 0, and 0. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Chuck Grassley, FRC scorecard 94. No on Respect for Marriage Act, no on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC score is 500. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Made a statement against Obergefell. Bill Hagerty, FRC scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act. HRC score 0. Josh Hawley, FRC 2018 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act. HRC scores 0 and 0. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Made statements against Obergefell. John Hoeven, FRC Scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC score is 5-0-0. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools Amendment. Cindy Hyde-Smith, FRC 2018-2020 endorsement. FRC scorecard 94. No on Respect for Marriage Act. HRC scores 5-0. Signed onto a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Was against a judge from her home state because he isn't anti-trans enough for her. Ron Johnson, FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Human Rights Campaign score is 5-0-0. Made statements against Obergefell. John Kennedy, FRC scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act. HRC scores 10-0-0. James Lankford, FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. HRC score 0-0-0. Signed on to a brief in Obergefell urging SCOTUS not to recognize gay marriage. Signed on to a brief arguing on the side of discrimination in Bostock. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools Amendment. Mike Lee, FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC score is 5-0-0. Signed onto a brief arguing on the side of discrimination in Bostock. Signed onto a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools Amendment. Another one who wants warnings on TV shows with LGBT people so parents can protect their poor little babies from knowing we exist and declaring for some reason that the existence of LGBT people is inherently hypersexual. Cynthia Loomis, FRC scorecard 82, Human Rights Campaign score 13. Roger Marshall, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. HRC score is 0-0-0. Another one who wants those warnings on TV shows with LGBT people because parents need to protect their kids from knowing we exist. You know, gay people are all hypersexual and our existences are hypersexual, blah 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 blah. Jerry Moran, or Jerry Moron if you want. FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 88. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC score is 5-0-0. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools Amendment. Another one who wants those warnings on TV shows that have LGBT characters and people in them because parents need to protect their kids from knowing we exist. Blah blah blah. Mark Wayne Mullen. FRC scorecard from when he was a representative, 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. HRC scores 6-0-0. Signed on to a brief in Obergefell urging SCOTUS not to recognize gay marriage. Voted against the Violence Against Women Act because he doesn't want no non-discrimination language to include LGBT people. Lisa Murkowski, another one she's one of the better ones. She's okay. FRC scorecard 38, Human Rights Campaign scores 55-3-54. Rand Paul, FRC scorecard 100, but he didn't get an endorsement though. No on Respect for Marriage Act, no on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC scores 5-8-0, voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools Amendment. Rand criticized Obergefell and suggested that the right thing to do in light of that ruling is to just stop having legal marriage at all. Did the general mutilation to trans-affirming care whilst not acknowledging cosmetic intersex and cosmetic circumcision surgeries, almost as if he only cares when it can be used against trans people. Pete Ricketts didn't want school lunches to have a whole non-discrimination against LGBT people thing, and he didn't want to interpret Title IX protections to extend to queer people. He fought for Nebraska's gay marriage ban, said he disagrees with his sister being gay. Jim Risch, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act, no on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Human Rights Campaign score is 5-0-0. Signed onto a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools Amendment. Mitt Romney, who has improved as time has gone by, I suppose. FRC scorecard 53, Human Rights Campaign scores 31-7. He might be fine with gay marriage now, but he's not fine with the Equality Act, so, we can get married, but we also have to be open to getting discriminated against. Mike Rounds, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 94. No on the Respect for Marriage Act, HRC score 600. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Marco Rubio, Mr. Let Me Quote Bible Verses on Twitter himself. FRC 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Human Rights Campaign score 0, 0, and 0. He said he wants Obergefell overturned. Eric Schmidt argued against Bostock. Filed a lawsuit against the directive that school meal programs cannot discriminate against LGBT people. Rick Scott, FRC scorecard 100. No endorsement though. No on Respect for Marriage Act. His HRC score is 0 and 0. Signed on to the other Senator Scott's bill to force schools to out trans kids. Wants adoption agencies to be able to discriminate with impunity. Denies the existence of trans people. Wants gender-affirming care for minors banned. Wants trans women barred from sports. And doesn't want the government to be able to take data on orientation or gender identity. He thinks religion's a great excuse to discriminate. Tim Scott, Family Research Council 2022 endorsement, FRC scorecard 100. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. No on Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC score 0, 0, and 0. Signed on to a brief in Obergefell urging SCOTUS not to recognize gay marriage. Signed on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Wants a federal law forcing schools to out trans kids. Dan Sullivan, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 82. HRC score is 1400. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Doesn't like Obergefell, but doesn't seem to care enough to want to fight it. Tom Tillis, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 76. HRC score is 2000. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Seems to be in a hey, if Obergefell gets overturned, it's cool if some places discriminate and others don't. Can we all get along? Thing, which I guess that's something, some kind of evolution. Tommy Tuberville, FRC 2020 endorsement, FRC scorecard 94. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. HRC score 0 and 0. Tried to use COVID as an excuse to discriminate against trans kids in sports. JD Vance, called people opposed to the Don't Say Gay bills groomers, implying that we are pedophiles. In a deleted tweet, he attacked Bostock because apparently queer people should be discriminated against, Roger Wicker, FRC 2018 endorsement, FRC scorecard 88. No on the Respect for Marriage Act. No on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. HRC scores 5, 0, and 0. Sign on to a brief arguing for religious discrimination and adoption in Fulton v. Philadelphia. Voted against the Franken Don't Discriminate in Schools amendment. Made a statement against gay marriage. Senator Todd Young, FRC scorecard 65. HRC scores 1900. Some people I didn't really go into depth on because this is fucking exhausting. Reading through their statements, going through random articles to get snippets of their statements, following dead links, all to read homophobic statements over and over again, to see blatant transphobia splashed out there as if it's fact. That isn't to say that they're all like that. There are GOP senators who have stated support for queer people, our marriages, and non-discrimination laws, and interpret things in ways that protect us, but there aren't many of them. Okay, there are the senators. Sure, federal law is important, but what about those all-important state laws? So let's talk current GOP governors. Jesus Christ. Kay Ivey of Alabama used biological essentialism as the groundwork for her transphobia when banning affirming care for trans kids. Doesn't want trans kids using bathrooms. And signed her own Don't Say Gay law for K through 5. Assumedly, she'll want to take after DeSantis and expand it. Mike Dunleavy from Alaska. Alaska has this commission that investigates discrimination claims. After Bostock, they looked into discrimination against LGBT people. Well, Dunleavy rolled that back. He doesn't want trans kids using bathrooms and announced a bill forcing the outing of trans kids and anyone who joins the Gay Straight Alliance. That same bill, he wants trans people to be left out of lessons and conversation unless a parent signs some sort of permission slip. A Don't Say Trans bill. Sarah Huckabee Sanders from Arkansas wants bills banning trans kids from using the bathroom, but not from working dangerous jobs. wants to label all drag as erotic adult entertainment because drag queens reading to kids is the downfall of society or something. More accurately, a man in a dress makes Sarah feel icky and we have to protect Sarah's feelings from getting icky, but not the kids from working dangerous jobs. She was vehemently anti-gay marriage, and she did the "but my military readiness and trans people make it hard to fight" thing without evidence. Brian Kemp of Georgia. Kemp signed that stupid fucking gender-affirming care ban that allows for cosmetic surgery on intersex kids. He's against gay marriage and thinks SCOTUS will have to hear and maybe overturn Obergefell. Said he would sign a bill letting religious people discriminate against LGBT people. Brad Little of Idaho, anti-trans kids in bathrooms sort of person, signed a gender-affirming care ban. Also signed a bill critics say will force schools to out kids. He told the state health department to stop sponsoring Boise Pride. He signed a letter that, correctly interpreting sex discrimination to include sexual orientation and gender identity, is actually a danger to poor little girls. If we don't discriminate against the gays, what will happen to the girls? Eric Holcomb of Indiana signed a gender-affirming care ban that would also force trans kids to detransition, which does not take into account best practices in medical safety. He said it's fine for the state not to itself include non-discrimination ordinances for LGBT people because localities can do that. So if some want to discriminate and some don't, that's up to them. It's a really principled stance of, I guess blatant bigotry's okay. Can't the gays just let people hate them and have that enshrined in their law? Kim Reynolds of Iowa said that she'll sign Iowa's own kind of don't say gay law. Oh, and also she wants to force schools to out trans kids. She signed a gender-affirming care ban. Trans kids can't use bathrooms, according to her. Tate Reeves of Mississippi signed a gender-affirming care ban while also calling the concept of being trans a pseudoscience, implying it's evil to be trans and affirm people for who they are. Before he was governor, he threw his support behind a bill that would allow people to use religion to discriminate against gay people, including letting clerks not issue licenses, adoption agencies saying no to gay couples, and letting businesses refuse goods and services. Mike Parson of Missouri. Despite not wanting to support discrimination against us, Parson does think that we're morally wrong and doomed to hell because he personally is a sincere homophobic bigot. He removed an LGBT history exhibit that was hosted at a museum inside of their Capitol building. Supposedly it didn't follow proper procedure, but according to an article in the Missouri Independent, that supposed procedure has not been an issue or been followed for about 2 decades. That makes this a clear we just wanted an excuse to get rid of the gay display. Rag Gianforte of Montana signed a bill to let people use religion as an excuse to discriminate against LGBT people. He used to donate significantly to anti-LGBT hate groups, Family Research Council, Alliance Defending Freedom, and Focus on the Family. He fought against a local non-discrimination ordinance before being governor because he wants businesses to be able to discriminate. Jim Pillen of Nebraska tweeted that he hates gender-affirming care, wants to block it, he rejects data on mental health, and implies that being trans is an ideology and an evil ideology. He's against trans kids using the bathroom, he opposes the Equality Act and any non-discrimination ordinances, wants religious people to be able to discriminate, and he hates trans women. He wants schools to teach Christianity and ban sex ed, calling sex ed grooming, and given his views on discrimination, he probably wants kids taught that being gay is wrong and that gay people are pedophiles. Chris Sununu of New Hampshire. This may be a shock, but seems like maybe there's hope here, because he signed a conversion torture ban, so thank you. He also said he would veto a Don't Say Gay bill. Doug Burgum of North Dakota signed a ban on gender-affirming care. He signed a bill letting student groups discriminate if they feel like it, though it seems like he vetoed a measure calling gay people unhealthy and destructive, and another one that requires schools to be pronoun police against trans kids, so at least he's not completely horrible. Mike DeWine of Ohio. DeWine did sign an executive order that state employees cannot be discriminated against for being LGBT, so that is good. But he was also key opposition in the Obergefell case, and he said he didn't want actual non-discrimination laws to include LGBT people. So it's okay for an executive order only binding to state employees, but it's not okay for the state to have that for all LGBT people in a move that cannot be changed at a random governor's whim. Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma wants gender-affirming care banned. Henry McMaster of South Carolina. He's against gay marriage and said he would defend a ban on it. He signed a "yeah, let healthcare professionals use religion to discriminate if they want, who cares, fuck the queers" sort of bill. Oh, hey, remember how Trump gave an exemption to non-discrimination policies to South Carolina so that federal funds can go to adoption agencies that discriminate against LGBT people so long as they say it's because of their religion? That was requested by McMaster's administration. Kristi Noem of South Dakota. She heard that Biden wanted to do a non-discrimination with the USDA, and she said, "I'll sue! We want to discriminate!" Gender-affirming care ban. After banning trans women and trans girls from sports, Noem was asked about reported anxiety and depression rates amongst LGBT kids in South Dakota. Her response, "I don't know. I don't want to assume any sort of knowledge for anyone, but I don't think the governor is an idiot. And as such, I sincerely believe she does know and cannot admit it, simply because to admit it is to deal with the shame that comes from being a bigot." Mental health concerns amongst the LGBT population are increased, stoked, and sometimes wholeheartedly birthed from lack of affirmation, from bullying, from having their existence be a political conversation that adults debate and talk about how they are wrong and evil and confused and shouldn't be who they are. That is why governor. But you know that. You simply can't admit it, because to admit it is to admit the role that you have played in doling out harm and the role that your constituents have played in doling out harm. Bill Lee of Tennessee. Remember the former drag queen who passed a drag ban? That's him. He rejected federal funds to fight HIV. Now, besides that being a dick move, in combination with his general anti-LGBT sentiment, it's very likely that his prejudices played a part in this rejection. He signed a bill forcing schools to warn parents of any lessons or materials that might mention we queers and let them opt out of those lessons. That way we can be censored out of life. He banned gender-affirming care, and those who were receiving it before that ban can only continue to receive it until April 2024, effectively forcing detransition after that. Greg Abbott of Texas. Abbott wants citizens to turn in parents who affirm their trans kids. If you affirm your child, you're guilty of child abuse for him. He told the Social Work Board to get rid of non-discrimination protections for LGBT people and also for disabled people, because why not throw eugenics into your hatred for queers? After Obergefell, he flipped out and got mad because he hates gay people having rights. He suggested he wants a "don't say trans" law. He signed a bill letting people use religion as an excuse to discriminate in regards to adoption and foster care. And that bill prohibits Texas from terminating contracts with conversion torturers just because they did a little conversion torture on kids. Spencer Cox of Utah signed a conversion therapy ban. Sincerely, thank you for that. But you also banned gender-affirming care because I guess trans youth don't matter much to you. Phil Scott of Vermont. From all I can see after my brief stint Googling, I was very tired at this point. Scott seems to be another one of those actual conservative allies. He also calls out the hatred from his own party, so thank you, Governor. Glenn Youngkin of Virginia. Trans kids can't use the bathroom. They have to file paperwork to be able to change their pronouns, and schools have to out children. That's what his administration did. He's against gay marriage because he's personally homophobic, and he wants you to know that it's okay. It's just his personal belief that we shouldn't have rights. He won't actually do anything about it. He's just personally a bigot. That's okay, right? No. Fuck you. He's portrayed trans people as dangerous predators. Jim Justice of West Virginia signed a bill banning gender-affirming care. He signed a "yes, religion, use that to discriminate against people, yes." A bill whose authors rejected a "don't use this to discriminate" amendment, just in case you thought it was actually about a religion and not harming LGBT people. Mark Gordon of Wyoming. Gordon is resistant to actually enshrining anti-discrimination laws in actual law. He vaguely falls back on Bostock in a belief that no one should be discriminated against, which, yeah, agreed. But his unwillingness to codify that kind of gives away the game. It says to me he doesn't want LGBT anti-discrimination laws actually written out in his state because he wants the potential to discriminate to remain. Now, with those governors, there are some who are decent or even good on LGBT rights. Looking at them and their desire to protect the children, I have to ask, which of those states ban conversion torture? 4. Now, which of them allow, in some form, child marriage? Wyoming, 16 and up for marriage. If you're emancipated, you don't have any barriers preventing you from getting married, it seems, to anyone 16 or up. Pedophiles only need to get their targets emancipated. And guess what? They raised it to 16. Good job, Governor Gordon. Guess who upped it to 16 in the year of 2023? Governor Justice in West Virginia, that's who. The Republicans didn't want this, but they compromised. The gays are wrong, but the groomers, they're good. Now, if the parents agree, 16-year-olds can marry anyone up to the age of 20, which is a lot better than it could be, but one would think maybe the exemption should only be in the case of emancipation if you're going to have one at all. Maybe. Minors shouldn't be getting married, and especially not to adults. Hi, Virginia. Apparently, maybe the info I found is wrong, but apparently once you hit 16, you can marry anyone you want, no issue. That 43-year-old predator who definitely loves you and thinks you're mature for your age, sure, maybe he's grooming you, or has been grooming you, but why don't you just go get married? You can get married, just don't be trans. That would be child abuse. Hey there, Utah. I appreciate that you have some more guardrails along the way. I'm so glad that a 16-year-old can marry a 23-year-old. A college graduate, that's very helpful. Oh, what's that? A minor getting married for a second time doesn't have to jump through all of those administrative hoops? Oh wow, that doesn't sound fucked up at all. Texas, our great defender of children who endorse conversion torture. Oh, how protected be the emancipated 16-year-olds who may marry any adult they fancy. Surely that's not a law ripe for abuse by pedophiles. No, it's the gays who are groomers, not those adults who actually want to marry a child. Tennessee, you were so close to getting it. Just bump that age up by 1 year and you'll get rid of child marriage. Good luck. Though I guess good on you for endorsing a small age gap. That is something maybe. South Dakota, where Noam doesn't get why the kids are depressed, might as well let the parents ship them off at 16 to go get married to whoever. Protect them from being trans only. Let them get ravished. Good job. Luckily for South Dakota, South Carolina is the exact same way. Twinsies. Good job, Governor McMaster. You sure are protecting the children. Oklahoma, with its decent governor, apparently says if the parents are okay with it, 16-year-olds can marry whoever. If the courts are happy with it, any child can get married. That's not an avenue potentially ripe for abuse, bribes, and quid pro quos. Ohio, at least it's only 17 to 21. Just bump that minimum up by 1 year. You are so close to getting it. North Dakota, you can't have gender-affirming care, but you sure can have parents sending their 16-year-olds to get married to anyone. New Hampshire, when a parent and a judge love each other very much, they can let a 16-year-old get married to people who definitely aren't pedophiles despite wanting to marry a minor. Nebraska, 17 and up with parental consent. Cool. Just 1 year. Up it. Fix it. Montana. Oh, Montana, if your parents say so and you go get counseling, 2 sessions at least, where surely there won't ever be a counselor in the pockets of your parents or spouse, and definitely won't ever push you in the direction of getting married, you can marry the pedophile of your choice. You know, Missouri, I'm not really a fan of you having child marriages at all, but saying it has to be between 16 to 21 is at least better than some of your friends. Oh, and having parental consent, I guess. Mississippi. They said, how can we make our child marriage provision even worse? Well, let's make it sexist. 17-year-old boys and 15-year-old girls can marry whoever with parental consent. Anyone younger than that can as well, but they have to get judges to approve. Tell girls that they're of marrying age at 15. That surely won't damage their psyches or cause generalized sexism. Iowa, the land of where if parents give the okay, kids of 16 can marry whoever. Indiana, 16 to 20 or 17 to 21, and the approval of a judge. That's better than a lot of places. You know, hopefully your judges are very strict about when they allow that. Idaho, the most reasonable of the ones listed, sticks a 3-year age gap on marrying 16 or 17-year-old children. My current state of Georgia, you can marry at 17 if you're emancipated with a small age gap and after completing some sort of, I guess, educational course thing. So far, that is the most understandable allowance, but still, just pump it up 1 year. Hi, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Guess what a 17-year-old is? That's right, a child who can get married in your state if their parents let them. Here's another question. What do you call an adult that wants to marry a child? A pedophile. Good job, Sarah. Alaska, the 3-year age gap is back, 16 and 17, parental and court consent. It's something, I guess. And finally, Alabama. Parents can give their age 16 kids to whoever they want. That's fine. You know, the majority of states in this country allow some form of child marriage, which I think is fucked up. I focused only on these ones because Republicans talk about how they're the ones who are so concerned with protecting children. So here's a challenge, governors. Call on your legislatures and demand answers and accountability and change the legislation. Or maybe admit that you don't care about kids, because if you did, you would ban conversion therapy, you would ban child marriage, you would look at the data and listen to medical experts and concerned affirmation both in medical care and in general acceptance. Forcing LGBT kids out of society and out of conversation does not make them not LGBT. It makes them alone and scared and hurt. Interlude. To break up the continuum of bigotry, I want to cut in here with resources. The Human Rights Campaign conducts research, lobbies politicians, and fights for LGBT+ rights across the country. The Trevor Project is an LGBT+ youth advocacy organization whose goal is to improve the mental health of kids and reduce suicide rates. They offer crisis support, for instance. The ACLU is the leading legal defender of civil rights in the United States, issuing legal challenges to unconstitutional laws and fighting for LGBT people. Coming right on the heels of the ACLU in legal battles and advocacy for the community, there's Lambda Legal. Advocacy group GLAD has further resources and links in the few I've mentioned. They also helped me find several of the sources I have used in this video. But what about me? I think some of the defense of the GOP and the hand-waving away of homophobia and transphobia is because, like my loved one I mentioned at the start, the conservatives issuing the denials are maybe not themselves homophobic, or at least they say they aren't. And you know what? I'll believe you. You're against conversion torture, you're against discrimination, you're pro-marriage equality. You don't believe in using religion as an excuse to be bigoted. You don't think existing as an LGBT+ person is wrong. You don't think our existences are inherently inappropriate. You yourself are not a bigot. That is the truth that you hold in your heart. Okay. Cool. So why do you let your party be that way then? Why do you defend it against accusation of bigotry when the platforms and elected officials are against queer rights? Because you're not a bigot. And the people you know personally who are also conservatives aren't really bigots. And those accusations feel like attacks, don't they? Like a denial of your reality and your beliefs. And yet you vote for those people. You let them craft policies that harm us in your name. So here's the thing. It doesn't really matter. Votes for people dedicated to the overturning of queer rights legitimizes those people. It empowers their bigotry. It gives them the power to harm us. If you're a conservative who is not a homophobe, then you need to get your party in line. You need to object to their policies. You need to vote in primaries against the bigots. You need to protest. You need to call them. You need to tell them that they are wrong. And you have to justify the harm they do to us, because it is, by extension, harm that you do to us. If you feel there is no other option because you can't vote for liberal policies, then you need to toughen up and pull your fucking socks up. You need to look at the candidates on your side and you need to run for office. Challenge them in primaries. Win local elections. Get power in your county party, state, national. Push for change and condemn and censor every action and politician that attacks the LGBT community. The evidence is overwhelming. The GOP is a homophobic party. It is transphobic. It wishes to cause harm. It makes that explicit in its platforms and across the majority of its elected members on the national level. To continue to vote for it and condone its policies is to surrender any personal claim that you yourself are not a bigot and the party you support is not bigoted. To admit the GOP is bigoted is painful for you, I get it. It's the same reason bigots rarely accept the labels of racist or homophobe, because to hate and advocate against someone's rights is shameful, and we know this. And to admit the GOP is bigoted is to admit that you have participated in causing harm, and the shame that admission would bring terrifies you. You don't want to be the villain. No one wants to be the villain. Thus, you have to defend the harm. You have to. It's the only way to shut off the guilt. So you deny it, you push away the claims, you roll your eyes, you say that no one really cares that much about taking away our rights. But that's not true. The party is invested in it, regardless of what you personally believe. We all do harm. All of us. We go about life damaging each other, and that knowledge can be crippling. I understand. Admitting that harm feels like labeling ourselves as a bad person. that doesn't excuse us. We have to apologize. We try to be better. We build a better word. We have to plant more than we destroy. But we can only do that if we are willing to recognize at least some of the damage that we inflict. So you have two options. Stop voting for people who harm us, or tell the LGBT people in your life that the harm you inflict on them is okay with you. And I can promise you'll likely never see us again. In reading through all of these statements and court documents and policy pages, there is so much concern that homophobes, especially religious homophobes, might be labeled bigots and have people not respect their beliefs. So let me help ease your fears. A religious belief that marriage is only between a man and a woman is bigoted. A belief that being LGBT is immoral is bigoted. A belief that queer people should be celibate is bigoted. I do not respect those beliefs because they're shameful. Bigoted, cruel beliefs used to inflict harm. I don't care about your God. If he's a homophobe, then fuck him. I'll call him shameful. Something being in the name of religion doesn't suddenly make it respectable. There are people who are and have been racist in the name of religion. People who are sexist in the name of religion. People who are violent and cruel in the name of religion. And those are sincerely held beliefs. And yes, there are purely secular people who do all of the same things. And all of them as well hold beliefs that are shameful. Bigotry is shameful. And shame is not a useful feeling. You have to cast it off and accept and move and try to do better. That's all any of us can do. Conclusion. Now, what was the point in all this? Most on the left already know about the bigotry of the GOP and don't need details. Those on the right who refuse to see and accept it may well continue to deny it. They might not believe homophobia and transphobia are even valid concepts. So why make this? Why spend all this time reading documents and writing this out and recording it? On some level at this point, I don't know. I figured out my sexuality sometime between 2010 and 2012. I was in high school when Obergefell was decided. When I was beginning to understand my sexuality, I went Googling around and I read a lot of articles about states voting on gay rights. I would go to the comments and I would read threads of people complaining that gay men are pedophiles, that gay marriage is evil. I read pages of material presenting theories on why queer people exist. I didn't know what social contagion theory was, but I consumed a decent amount of material about it. It was my father's fault. It was my mother's fault. Gay people recruit children. But I didn't know any gay people. I never talked to any. So then, those pages suggested I was assaulted. I wondered, I searched my memories, maybe I blocked it out. Suddenly I had the bubbling of a trauma that did not exist in a future prescribed for me where, according to these same people, I could only cause harm to others. I have at some point or other thought about dying every single year since I was 13. Growing up in a small town in Kentucky, I heard often, not at home thankfully, about how gross and wrong the gays are. When Obergefell happened, people I knew talked about how the world was ending. People I knew from back then have gone on to blame school shootings on allowing gay people to live our lives out of the closet. But these people, I was told, were not homophobic. They were sincere. And I didn't know what to do with that pain. When my politics were forming, I had no choice but to become a Democrat, which has led me on the road to being what I think I would describe as a social democrat. Maybe. I may well have gotten this way eventually no matter what, but of the two parties, both filled at the time with horrid demeaning language, mind you, only one had members actively voting for and advocating for my rights and my dignity as a human person. The GOP is not even remotely an option, and it has never been for me. I will fight and argue against conservative policies no matter what. I just don't agree with them. But we need to get to a point where these bigotries are no longer pretended to have a good place in debate. I will not debate my rights with you. I will defeat you. Because those against human rights will lose. That is the truth. And maybe this collection, this video, will make one person realize that yes, actually, the party they support is homophobic. It harms people. Maybe they'll vow to change it, or maybe they'll understand that letter from the start. And maybe they'll pledge to no longer vote for the GOP because they cannot bear to harm any longer. Not now that they know. I guess this is my final statement. Go and run for office, everyone. Fill local positions. Don't let anyone run unopposed. And protest relentlessly. Good luck. There's a link going by that I thought I deleted.